Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about What If Deku Had a Villain's Legacy Part 1. If you guys enjoy this What If and want to see Part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content. And leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story 𝗧𝗵𝗲 from AO3. So let's start the video. A legacy is born. Chapter text. The rising sun peeked through the curtains, shining a small sliver of light right on his eyes. Izuku woke up, grumbling at the annoyance of the light. He stretched and smacked his lips, sitting up in his bed and rubbing the sleep from his eyes. After a moment of contemplation, Izuku realized he felt weird. Not bad weird, or even really good weird. Just weird. He'd turned 4 a few days ago and had been disappointed when he didn't feel any change to himself. He hadn't been able to pull objects or breathe fire like either of his parents, but now his body felt odd, as if it was searching for something. He frowned, then hopped out of bed and padded out into the living room of the Midoriya apartment. In the kitchen, his mom was busy making breakfast, and Izuku suddenly felt an odd pull towards her. He didn't really understand why. He'd never been clingy with his mom before, though of course he loved her. Then, his dad walked in, apparently having had to run some errands that morning, and Izuku was overwhelmed by the aura coming off of Midoriya Izuku. The man slipped his shoes off, setting them to the side, then looked up to see Izuku staring at him. He cocked his head before a wide grin spread across his face. Well, little Izuku, 𝗧𝗏 said, walking towards Izuku and scooping him up into his arms. It seems your quirk came in, and is exactly what I hoped. Oh, did it come in? 𝗃𝐞𝐤𝐮 said from the kitchen. She scurried out, an apron around her waist and a dish towel draped over her shoulder. She wiped some flour on her apron. My quirk? Izuku asked, confused, before his eyes widened in excitement. So I do have a quirk. 𝗧𝗏 chuckled. Seems so, little one, and I do believe it's a version of mine. Tell me, do you feel an oddness coming from either me or your mom? Izuku nodded. Then you're probably detecting our quirks, and I suppose I'll have to apologize for how strongly the feeling is coming from me, won't I? Izuku's mouth screwed to the side. But what kind of quirk do I have? He asked. Well, let's test something, 𝗧𝗏 said. Look for that feeling coming from your mom. Izuku did so, closing his eyes. As he reached out for his mom, he saw something akin to a string in his mind, with the end just waiting to be pulled on. He grabbed it and pulled and suddenly felt as if a piece had been added to him. He opened his eyes to see his closed fist glowing. He opened it, revealing a small, green wisp. Fantastic. Now, close your fist again and let that melt into your body, 𝗧𝗏 said. Izuku once again did as he was told. Now, see the TV remote. Try to pull it like mom does. Izuku furrowed his brow and reached out with his hand, trying to pull on the remote. It shuddered for a moment before slowly floating off the arm of the couch and into the air. It floated there, amazing Izuku. He tugged again. The remote moved towards him a little. Oh my, 𝗃𝐞𝐤𝐮 said, tears filling her eyes. She smiled at Izuku, wiping her eyes with the dish towel. You really do have your father's quirk. Izuku turned to look at her, confused. But Daddy's quirk is fire breath. Right. His lapse in focus caused the telekinetic hold on the remote to end and the device began to plummet to the ground. But before it did, 𝗃𝐞𝐤𝐮 grabbed it with her own quirk, out of instinct. When she realized what she'd done, she stared wide-eyed at 𝗧𝗏. Wait, he didn't take it? She asked her husband. 𝗧𝗏's grin appeared to grow wider, if that were even possible. He didn't, because it's a different version of my quirk. Whereas I can give and take, he can copy. Oh my, he's exactly what you hoped. 𝗃𝐞𝐤𝐮 cried happily, tears falling down her cheeks. Oh, 𝗧𝗏, I'm so happy for us. I'm confused, Izuku said quietly, clinging to his dad's shirt and staring up at him. 𝗧𝗏 still held Izuku in his arms, and he turned to look down at his son. Izuku, little one, we've kept some secrets from you, he said. First, you never would have had a chance to get fire breathing. Sorry to disappoint you. Aw, Izuku said, pouting. At least he had his mom's quirk. 𝗧𝗏 chuckled. Well, you were either going to get 𝗃𝐞𝐤𝐮's telekinesis, but stronger, or you were going to get my actual quirk. And no, you did not get your mom's quirk. Instead, you copied it. But you'll have it forever now, if I'm right about your quirk. He turned to look at 𝗃𝐞𝐤𝐮. After breakfast, I'll take him to see the doctor, who should be able to confirm it. Can't you check yourself, dear? 𝗃𝐞𝐤𝐮 asked. I could, but I don't want to risk any odd interactions between our quirks. The doctor can do some checks because of our research, and if things check out, then I do believe little Izu and I will have a great time exploring his quirk. 𝗧𝗏 ruffled Izuku's hair and laughed. If his quirk is what we think it is, then the project that the doctor and I have been working on will be pointless. I'm bad for your work? Izuku asked, lip wobbling as he thought he ruined something for his dad. Oh, little one, no, 𝗧𝗏 said, caressing Izuku's cheek. You're so good that you make the work we did unneeded. If your quirk is what we hope it to be, then all of our science and experimentations won't matter. Because you will be able to do what we've been trying to for years. So, I'm good and helpful. Izuku asked, looking between his parents. Could I be a hero, then? Hisashi's face briefly morphed into a scowl, but his grin was back before Izuku looked at him again and could have noticed. Maybe, Izuku. But first, we'll need to see what the doctor says. Okay, Izuku said happily, squirming out of Hisashi's arms. His dad set him back on the ground and Izuku darted off to his room, planning to get dressed before breakfast so that he could go see the doctor sooner. Hisashi walked with Izuku to their family doctor's clinic. The Midoriyas had been taking Izuku there since he was born, and he'd only ever had the one doctor, Dr. 𝗬𝗵𝗲. His dad just referred to Dr. 𝗬𝗵𝗲 as the doctor, which Izuku always found funny. So, what can Dr. 𝗬𝗵𝗲 do? Izuku asked as they walked down the sidewalk. The clinic was only a 10-minute trek from their apartment. Well, first he'll double-check that you don't have an extra toe joint. You know why, don't you? Hisashi asked. Izuku had been obsessed with quirks ever since he could first talk. It hadn't been great that he'd also ended up obsessed with All Might of all people, but Hisashi put up with it. Yeah, an extra toe joint is a sign of quirklessness. Izuku answered excitedly. But I used a quirk, so doesn't that mean I won't have it? Hisashi chuckled. Yes, it should. But it is always beneficial to check, just to ensure there are no issues. Izuku nodded fiercely, understanding the importance. They walked into the clinic and were met with the nurse who ran the front desk. Hisashi remembered that her name was Kimura. Ah, hello Mr. Midoriya. And little Izuku. Oh, is Dr. 𝗬𝗵𝗲 expecting you? Kimura asked. He should be, yes. I called him directly. I do apologize for bypassing you, Ms. Kimura. Oh, no worries, Kimura said, waving him off. You two have your research projects, so of course you'd go straight to him. I hope those are going well. I'll let him know you're here. Just take a seat and it should only be a moment. Izuku skipped over to a chair and crawled up onto it, sitting patiently. Hisashi smiled as he walked over to sit next to Izuku. It was only a few minutes before the short doctor hobbled out into the waiting room. He caught sight of the two Midoriyas and grinned. Oh, Hisashi, the doctor called out. Come on back. I'm sure we have plenty to go over with young Izuku. Hisashi stood up. Izuku quickly followed and began to walk after the doctor. They were led into one of the rooms far in the back of the clinic, for privacy among other things. So, Izuku, the doctor said, taking a seat on his stool and rolling it over to the medical bed that Hisashi had helped Izuku up on. Your father says you manifested your quirk. I think so, Izuku said, but I don't know what it is, and Daddy won't tell me. He said you have to check some things, and then you two can tell me what it is. The doctor hummed, nodding. Yes, he told me. First up, we need to check those feet of yours. So, lay down on the bed. As Izuku did so, Hisashi grabbed a lead plate as well as a drape. The plate was slid under Izuku's legs and feet, and the drape was laid across his thighs. The doctor then carted over a mobile X-ray machine and placed it so it was above Izuku's legs. He pressed a few buttons, causing an audible click. He moved the machine back over to the side of the room, and then typed away at the computer next to it. The screen on the wall lit up to show the X-ray results. Hisashi put away the plate and drape. He beckoned for Izuku to sit up and pointed towards the screen. Izuku slid his body across the bed to sit at the end of it closest to the screen. Ah, yes, as you can see, no extra joint, the doctor said, zooming in on Izuku's toes. So, yes, you must indeed have a quirk. Now, onto what that quirk is. Have you tried using it yet? Yeah, Izuku said. I used my mom's quirk, but it was like I pulled a string to use it. And then there was this wisp, as Daddy called it, in my hand. 𝗏𝗏 was still able to use her quirk, even after Izuku used it, Hisashi added. Izuku nodded quickly in agreement. Well, isn't that perfect? The doctor muttered. Are you still able to use 𝗏𝗏's quirk? Izuku, try on this. He pulled out a small flashlight from his coat's breast pocket. Izuku stuck his tongue out in concentration as he tried to use his mom's quirk again. He raised his hand and reached out in the same way he had with the remote. The flashlight shook for a moment before being lifted from the doctor's hand and towards Izuku. He continued to tug on it with the quirk until it rested in his own hand. He cheered in excitement and smiled at Hisashi and the doctor. Wonderful, the doctor said. He turned to Hisashi. We need to ensure he can copy more and keep the previous. How do you want to proceed? Hisashi said, bringing a hand to his chin in thought. Do you think my quirk and his are compatible? I do not want to risk them causing damage to each other if he tries copying from me. I don't see why they would be, sir, the doctor said. Either he copies yours, or you, well you know. Him being able to copy yours is perfect. If he copies yours, then transfers a copy of a quirk to someone else, can he then copy it again? That would make the project so much simpler, Hisashi said, nodding. Izuku looked between his dad and the doctor, confused. Daddy, he asked, tugging at Hisashi's shirt. Oh, little one, I'm sorry. We got caught up thinking how useful you will be to our research, like I told you that you would be, Hisashi said, ruffling Izuku's hair. So, we believe your quirk is the ability to copy any other quirk, while leaving the owner with the original. First, we want to see if it's a permanent copy, and won't be replaced if you copy another quirk. That's all we can really check at the moment. Oh, okay, Izuku said nervously. So do I copy your quirk? Hisashi chuckled. Not exactly. My quirk is a bit too much for you to handle, but I have more than one. He tapped Izuku on the nose as Izuku's eyes widened in awe. I'm going to manifest one for you to focus on. It should be easy, since I've gotten used to suppressing others. You'll copy that one and we'll see if you can use it in your mom's quirk. Izuku nodded. Hisashi debated which quirk to bring forward. He needed one that a 4-year-old could handle without issue, without causing damage to himself, them, or the room, and that he could control. Figuring a simple water manipulation quirk couldn't go wrong, he pulled the hydrokinesis he had to the forefront of his quirks. All right, Izuku, I have one ready. It's hydrokinesis. Do you know what that means? He asked. Yes, it's the ability to control water, Izuku answered. Hisashi ruffled his hair again, causing him to smile. So I just do what I did with Mom. Correct. Look for the thread, then pull on it. Izuku closed his eyes again and reached out with his actual quirk. He saw a loom of threads ahead of him, but one specific one was in front of him. He didn't want to upset his dad, so he only grabbed the one being pushed towards him, but he was still in awe of the many threads that made up his dad. He pulled the singular thread, and then opened his eyes. Once again, a small wisp floated in his hand, this time blue. He clenched his fist and felt the quirk absorb into his body. Fascinating, the doctor mumbled, typing away at his computer while also watching Hisashi and Izuku. Very good, Izuku. Now, Hisashi walked over to the sink in the room and turned it on. Try and control the water. You don't need to do much, just enough to show you have the quirk. Izuku reached out with his hand again and pulled at the water. The stream from the faucet wavered for a moment, then began to coalesce into a bubble, increasing in size as the faucet continued to feed it. Izuku pulled the bubble away and towards him. He floated it around his head, giggling. I'm doing it, he cheered. He pushed the bubble back over to the sink and let it go, causing a splash. Indeed, very good, Izuku, Hisashi said. Now, one more time, try using your mom's quirk. He picked up the small flashlight, which Izuku had set next to him on the bed after pulling it to him earlier, and held it in his palm. Same as before. Izuku once again pulled the flashlight towards him. Hisashi clapped once, proud of his son. Then, to prove to the doctor the quirk was indeed only a copy, he used the hydrokinesis he'd pulled on and grabbed water of his own. He momentarily gave Izuku a water halo, causing the boy to giggle with delight again, before directing the water back to the sink and turning off the faucet. So now we'll have to see how long he keeps the quirks, the doctor said. It's been an hour since he copied 𝗏𝐾𝐤𝐮. Yes. The only other copy quirk we've seen manifest only lasts 5 minutes. Hisashi scowled at that. The other had been such a disappointment, but if Izuku's quirk was indeed what they hoped, then he'd leave the weaker copy quirk behind and focus entirely on Izuku and 𝗏𝐾𝐤. He'd always preferred 𝗏𝐾𝐤 anyway. Indeed, of the temporary quirks I've seen, none have ever lasted beyond an hour. That copy quirk, size manipulation, others like it. I do believe Izuku's quirk is a full adaptation of mine. Hisashi turned from the doctor back to Izuku. So, little one, now I shall tell you of my real quirk. Izuku looked giddy, fidgeting on the bed in excitement. My quirk allows me to take the quirk of someone else and use it as if it's always been mine. As you probably had as well. I can even understand the basis of how to utilize the quirk without previous experience. Izuku's mouth dropped open, amazed. But then it clamped shut and he frowned, looking off the side for a moment, before meeting Hisashi's eyes once more. But, if you take them, doesn't that mean you make someone quirkless? Hisashi figured this would be the first question Izuku would have. With his obsession with quirks came the knowledge of quirklessness. And of course, the slightly delayed manifestation of his quirk didn't help his worry about such a disorder. It does mean that. Yes, Hisashi said, taking a seat next to Izuku on the medical bed. Izuku turned so he sat side by side with Hisashi. Some people do not deserve their quirks. They use them for the wrong purposes, and society is safer with those people being quirkless. It was a mostly true statement, though of course those people were sometimes heroes, and society was only safer because it served his plan to rule. And, what about people who are old or sick? They're quirks that could be so useful, but would die alongside their owners. Shouldn't those be kept, to possibly be given to someone else who may want or need it? Given? Can you give quirks, too? Izuku asked. Indeed I can. But if I give it away, I no longer have it. However, your quirk merely copies the original. I could take your copy. Hisashi pulled 𝗏𝐾𝐤𝐮's quirk out of Izuku, holding the green wisp in front of the boy, and then give it to someone else. Then 2 people could now use the quirk. And if you could copy it again, we'd be able to offer useful quirks to anyone we want. He then put the quirk back into Izuku, the wisp melting into the boy's body once more. Whoa, Izuku said in amazement. Of course, you're still young, so we won't go trying that for a while. You need to get used to your quirk, Hisashi said. Now, would you like to meet a friend of mine? He'll most likely become your babysitter, so that your mom and I can go back to work without having to worry about you getting into any trouble. He ruffled Izuku's hair again. Are they nice? Izuku asked. They are, and they have a very impressive quirk themselves. Hisashi nodded to the doctor, who messaged someone from his phone. A moment later, a swirl of purple and black mist covered the far wall of the exam room. Two long yellow eyes manifested before the mist collapsed into the shape of a man wearing an elegant suit. You summoned me? The man asked, his voice a deep baritone. Kurogiri, meet my son. Izuku, Hisashi said, gesturing to Izuku. Izuku, this is Kurogiri, our assistant in our research, among other things. His quirk, as you just saw, is a warping one. He can teleport himself anywhere which he has the coordinates for. He can also open warp gates for other people to walk through. Kurogiri, if you would. Kurogiri formed a small portal near Hisashi, another forming across the room. Hisashi stuck his hand through. It disappeared for a moment before reappearing as it emerged from the other portal. Izuku squealed in excitement. Hisashi laughed as he pulled his hand back. Kurogiri closed the portal soon after. Kurogiri will walk you home from school and be around to help take care of you. I'm afraid the doctor and I will still be busy with some of our projects, so I won't always be able to be home with you. And I've encouraged your mom to go back to work as well. You're growing up. You have to be a big boy. I am a big boy. I have a quirk now, Izuku said, grinning. He still stared at Kurogiri in amazement. Can I copy his quirk? Kurogiri's eyes narrowed at that. Hisashi just chuckled. Not yet, no. His quirk is a tad complicated, and you'll need a lot of training to handle it. But when you're older, we'll see. Awa, Izuku pouted, crossing his arms. Yet he couldn't fully hide his smile. Now, though, we will need to set some rules, Hisashi said, standing up from the bed and turning to look down at Izuku. Do not go copying quirks from your friends at school. You should only copy quirks when we say you can. I promise you that you will have ample opportunity to copy quirks you want when you're older. Until then, stick to quirks I give you, understand? Yes, Daddy, Izuku said. But how will I show off my quirk? Kaken already shows his off all the time. Hisashi frowned. I'm afraid, little one, that you can't. Our quirks, they scare people. That's why, to the 𝗵𝘃𝐤𝐵 and all others who know our family, I merely have a fire-breathing quirk. If they knew I could give and take quirks, they'd probably be scared of me. And the heroes don't like someone like me. I discovered that when I was young. But heroes are supposed to be the good guys. Why would they be afraid of you? Can't you help them against dangerous villains? Hisashi sighed. Perhaps, but they'd never give me the chance. He glanced back at the doctor and Kurogiri. Just understand that heroes aren't solely good. Izuku frowned but nodded. Hisashi knew it'd take some time to push Izuku away from his hero obsession. But he couldn't just make his son into the heir of a shadow empire. Not yet. One day, Izuku would sit next to him on the throne. But before then, Hisashi still needed to achieve his final goal. And All Might stood in his way. Okay, that's all we needed to come here for. But I still need to discuss some things with the doctor. Why don't we have Kurogiri take you home, 𝗧𝗵𝗲? Hisashi asked, picking up Izuku and setting him on the ground. Is he gonna warp us home? Izuku asked excitedly. I'm afraid not, Hisashi said, smiling and shaking his head. You'll have to walk home today. I promise we'll let you experience his port soon, though. Okay. Izuku hugged Hisashi's legs. Will you be home for dinner? I should be, yes. All right, bye Daddy, Izuku said, taking the outstretched hand from Kurogiri and walking out with the man. Hisashi could hear the chattering Izuku asking Kurogiri questions as soon as they entered the hallway, and he shook his head amused. Well, he's exactly what you wanted. Pity the other attempt failed, the doctor said. Shall we continue our discussion here, or would you like me to have Johnny teleport us to the main lab? The main lab. While Izuku grows, we still need to work on our backup copying process. He may need the quirks in the future, and having a catalog of quirks would be beneficial for both of us. Right, the doctor said. He dialed a number on his phone. It rang once before it was automatically answered by the lab's systems. Johnny, teleport me and Master to the lab. Black liquid filled his mouth, bubbling out to engulf him. A moment later he was standing in their lab, stasis tanks lining the sides. In the middle was their workstation where a body was strapped down. A failed attempt at a Namo, but they kept the heart beating as it still held a few quirks. He'd have to take those back. The doctor immediately went to his desk, taking a seat and downloading the notes he'd taken during Izuku's exam. He then pressed a call button. Ms. Kimura, I will be out of the office for the rest of the day. You may close the clinic. There weren't any further appointments today. The nearby speaker crackled. All right, Dr. Tsubasa. Have a good day. Kimura had to enjoy working with the doctor. She got paid for a full day regardless of whether or not he kept the clinic open the entire day. I do think we're near a breakthrough, the doctor said, turning to face him. The samples in the last round of tests almost stabilized before degrading too far to hold onto the quirk. I don't wish to overstep, but perhaps some of young Izuku's blood would help. He thought for a moment. It might, yes. He's due for his final round of booster shots, and we can take some blood during that. I'm sure he'd be ecstatic to assist his father, if we even need to explain why we're taking the blood. Perfect, the doctor said. Now, what about your other little experiment? Shigaraki Tamura. He hummed. Kurogiri will continue to assist in caring for Tamura when not taking care of Izuku. However, Tamura is no longer the pawn I planned for. Izuku is far more important, and has far more potential, except for his obsession with heroes. The doctor said. Yes, except for that. I do wonder what he'd think if we revealed to him the truth of All for One and One for All. Perhaps when he is older. All Might is not a threat, for now. I'd rather focus on this work before attempting to take One for All from him. Given his master was such a disappointment, I'm sure he is as well. Despite his ridiculous position as the symbol of peace, the doctor nodded. For now, we continue with our usual projects, then. Will Kurogiri be returning to the brat after taking Izuku home? Yes, Inko is aware of the plan. She thinks it commendable that I'm caring for an orphan, All for One said, chuckling. I continue to find it so peculiar how easily she accepted the truth of your history, the doctor said. Are you still sure she isn't biding her time to turn us in? I am. She works in a law firm, currently as a paralegal. If she cared to take us down, she'd have done so. Instead, she's been looking into cases against heroes. So far, she's found several that would absolutely ruin the heroes in question. But the law firm is holding them back, I presume. Indeed, with Kurogiri helping take care of Izuku, I'm encouraging Inko to work towards becoming a lawyer. She's smart. Izuku doesn't only get his intelligence from me. If she becomes a lawyer, I'm sure she'll take down many a hero with ease. Back to work, then, the doctor said, whirling around his chair and typing away at the computer. All for One just hummed, regarding the many experiments that made up the lab. They had their work cut out for them, still. But perhaps the doctor was right in that Izuku was the key to their projects, alongside his destiny as All for One's right hand. Izuku hated not being able to use his quirk, but his dad had told him it could be dangerous if people found out what he could do. He didn't want to cause trouble for his parents, so he listened to his dad and pretended to be quirkless. It sucked. Bakugo Katsuki, his childhood friend, had turned on him almost instantly, always bullying him and telling him he was a worthless Deku. But Izuku still wanted to be friends, and his parents had said he'd be able to tell people about his quirk when he was older, so he continued to follow after Bakugo. Though, that only made the bullying worse. On top of that, he constantly saw the threads of the quirks from those around him. Hisashi had told him he'd get used to it and be able to ignore them unless he actively wanted to copy a quirk. Apparently that was how All for One worked as well. He thought his dad was so cool for being able to handle all that pressure. Wanting to help his dad's work, he'd been happy to let Dr. Tsubasa draw some blood over the years since his quirk manifested. Apparently, because of his quirk, something in his blood became the final piece to the puzzle that they'd needed to allow for their artificial quirk copying. Izuku didn't know why they were so interested in copying quirks, and his dad wouldn't really explain it fully, just explain around it, always going back to what he'd said when Izuku first got his quirk. The ability to offer quirks to those who need them was a blessing. And with the copying, they wouldn't have to remove quirks from other people like his dad could do with All for One. Kurogiri had become one of Izuku's favorite people, and after his 8th birthday, he'd finally been allowed to copy Kurogiri's quirk, Warp. He definitely caused a few accidents as he learned how to use it. Most often it was because he got stuck in the portal he made, but he liked how using the quirk let him emit a green-black mist. It matched his hair, and it made his version different from Kurogiri's, which was purple and black. Along with Warp, Izuku had been allowed to copy a few more quirks from his dad. Nothing too dangerous, just some fun quirks that he could play with while he sat around in his dad's lab. The main one he'd had fun with was Air Walk. It let him walk through the air just like he did on the ground. His mom hadn't been too thrilled with his dad when he'd been given that quirk, though. He'd get himself into too much trouble, she'd said, between Air Walk and Warp. So Izuku had been given a lesson on the proper use of quirks, mainly when to use them, and so their home had become less of an accident zone. He only used the quirks when he was with his dad in a safe area of the lab. As he grew up, he noticed that Kaken's bullying came in waves, as if he was trying to avoid getting caught while also being just as ruthless as before. The teachers at 𝐓𝐷RA seemed to pay far more attention to Izuku, despite the fact he was listed as quirkless on his records. He'd seen how the one other quirkless kid at their school had been treated, by teachers and students alike. Yet he never had it as bad as them. Izuku didn't know why, but he wouldn't complain, even if he did feel bad for the other kid. On his 10th birthday, he'd been given a phone of his own, which made him ecstatic. He was allowed to walk around their neighborhood alone, as long as he had his phone on him. Sometimes he even warped himself to a candy store, though Kurogiri almost always showed up right after. He couldn't figure out how the warper always knew when Izuku'd used his warp, but he never got in any trouble. 𝗧𝗫𝐤𝐮 was just there to watch over him before sending him home. 𝗧𝗫𝐤𝐮 never came with him back home, at least not when one or both of his parents were there. Izuku guessed he only watched over Izuku when his parents couldn't be around. One night, his mom invited the 𝗵𝘃𝐤𝐮 over for dinner. 𝗧𝗫𝐤𝐮 had actually shown up to help 𝐂𝐞𝐤𝐮 cook that night, while Izuku just watched. The Midoriyas and 𝗵𝘃𝐤𝐮 got together often, having dinner at one of their homes or sometimes going out to eat. But every time, Hisashi was always busy. Izuku knew, of course, that his dad was busy working with Dr. Tsubasa on their projects, but his mom just made up some excuse that Hisashi was out of town. One time, when his dad had been busy for a few months, she'd even claimed he was working abroad, in America. There was a knock at the front door, pulling Izuku out of his thoughts. "Can you get that, Izuku?" "It should be the 𝗵𝘃𝐤𝐮," 𝗵𝐾 said from the kitchen. 𝗧𝗫𝐤𝐮 was busy setting the table, very carefully setting each dish and utensil in its proper place with precision. "Sure," Izuku said, hopping up from the couch and padding down the hallway to their front door. He opened it to find Katsuki glaring at him. Behind him was his parents, Mitsuki and Masaru. "Hi auntie, uncle," Izuku greeted them. "Hello Izuku, I hope we're not too early," Uncle Masaru said. "Nope, Mom is almost done cooking, I think. Plus, you're always welcome," Izuku said, standing to the side to let the 𝗵𝘃𝐤𝐮 in. He watched as they toed off their shoes and set them to the side, then entered the apartment. He closed the door behind them and followed. "Oh, 𝗃𝐻, that smells damn good," Auntie Mitsuki said as she walked towards the kitchen. Masaru made himself at home on the couch, with Katsuki following him. The boy seemed annoyed at being there. Izuku wasn't surprised. "I sure hope so," 𝗃𝐻 said, turning from her cooking to greet Mitsuki. "I've worked all day on it." "And who's this?" Mitsuki asked as 𝗧𝗫𝐤𝐮 finished setting the table. "And where's Hisashi? Don't tell me he's busy again." "Sadly, yes. You know how his work is," 𝗃𝐻 said, chuckling. "And this is 𝗧𝗫𝐤𝐮, a family friend who watches Izuku while Hisashi and I work. I can't believe you've never met before." "Good evening, Mrs. Bakugo," 𝗧𝗫𝐤𝐮 said, his rich baritone voice surprising the woman. "Pleasure to meet you, 𝗧𝗫𝐤𝐮. And please, just call me Mitsuki." "Mrs. Bakugo makes me feel old," Mitsuki said, laughing. "Because you are old, hag," Katsuki barked from the couch. "Oi, brat, shut it," Mitsuki said, glaring back at her son. Izuku watched 𝗧𝗫𝐤𝐮 take in the 𝗵𝘃𝐤𝐮. He of course knew of them. Hisashi had made sure to tell 𝗧𝗫𝗏𝗏 all about the Midoriya's friends. He'd even met Katsuki before, though the boy just huffed when he'd been denied the chance to bully Izuku and instead had stalked off on his own after school. Thankfully, Katsuki behaved himself when it came to Izuku during the times their families got together. So Izuku always used that to his advantage, getting to play and hang out with his friend as if nothing had changed. It still sucked that he couldn't show off his quirk, even in the safety of his own home. According to his dad, not even the 𝗵𝘃𝐤𝐮 were allowed to know of it yet. Even though he was 10, he still wasn't old enough according to his parents. He walked up to Katsuki, wringing his hands. Kaken, I got some new hero figures," he said nervously. Just because Katsuki behaved slightly better when around their parents, it didn't mean Izuku was any more confident. "TCH, whatever," Katsuki said. Izuku was disappointed for a moment before the other boy stood up and started walking to his room. "Well, are you coming or what, nerd?" Izuku lit up and trotted after Katsuki, heading to his bedroom to play while the adults chatted and 𝗃𝐻 finished cooking. "𝗧𝗫𝗏𝗏, keep an eye on them, would you?" 𝗃𝐻 whispered to the warper. He nodded and created a small, almost imperceptible portal in Izuku's bedroom in order to keep watch over the two kids. 𝗃𝐻 then turned back to the 𝗵𝘃𝐤𝐮. "So, Mitsuki, how's work?" "Oh, you know, same shit as always," the woman replied. "We have a show coming up, and are still missing a final design." "It's the intern show," Masaru added. "But some of them are, well, garbage," Mitsuki finished. "We only hire interns that look to have potential, based on their portfolios from school. But some of them this year have just been disappointments. Yet their portfolios were so well done. It baffles us. I've tried sitting down with them," Masaru continued, "and asking what happened to their work since they started with us. They all say the same thing, they're exhausted, overworked, all that kind of stuff. But you know as well as we do that we don't overwork our interns. We tell them to take their time, take breaks when they feel overworked, and focus on their schooling. All they needed to tell us was that they didn't have the time to make a design. Instead, they give us half-assed work, some being straight-up shitty copies of discarded designs from the agency. It's like they went through the shred bin to find something to use. Those designs were tossed for a reason," Mitsuki said, sighing. "Oh my, that's disappointing," 𝗃𝐻 said, frowning. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Yeah, well, nothing we can do now," Mitsuki shrugged. "On a better note, though, we've started branching out into support gear." "Oh, that's wonderful. Masaru, you must be excited. I know you focused more on that side of fashion in college." "Of course I am," Masaru said, chuckling. "We're essentially dividing the agency into two. One side will remain in normal fashion and be led by Mitsuki. The other side will be in support gear and be led by me. We've already begun to look for new hires that focus on support tech and have several applicants from UA. As soon as I mentioned them, Katsuki went off on one of his excited rants about how he'll go to UA one day and become the next #1 hero. Masaru shook his head, grinning. He's a little firecracker, that one. 𝗧𝗵𝗲, yes, I suppose he is, 𝗃 agreed. Still hasn't decided against becoming a hero. Huh, of course he hasn't, the little brat. He's obsessed with All Might and wants to be better than him, Mitsuki said. Pardon me, but would any of you like a drink? Kurogiri said, interrupting the hero talk before it could go farther. A bar cart sat next to him. 𝗃, of course, knew he'd just gotten it from the bar using one of his portals, but she wondered if Mitsuki or Masaru would comment on its sudden appearance. Sure, something strong for me. Bartender's choice, though, Mitsuki said. I didn't know you had a bar cart, Masaru said as he stood up from the couch. Oh, well, Kurogiri here is quite a masterful bartender. He brought it himself, since he was helping me host the dinner tonight, 𝗃 explained. She gave Kurogiri a knowing smile. They put up with Izuku's hero worship because they knew it was bound to end eventually, once he was let in on more of their secrets. But they didn't need to hear the 𝗃𝗃𝐤𝐮 pining about Katsuki's hero potential or any discussion of actual heroes, All Might in particular. As Kurogiri made their drinks, Mitsuki leaned against the counter next to 𝗃. So, how's your work, 𝗃? You started as a full lawyer earlier this year, so how's that going? Oh, it's wonderful. I have a backlog of cases that I'd started assisting on as a paralegal, because they were small time and the main lawyers of the firm didn't care for them. Plus the defendants weren't in any rush to see them brought to trial. But now I get to do that, and I've yet to lose a case. That's amazing, 𝗃. What'd I tell you back in college, huh? I said you'd make a great lawyer, Mitsuki said, taking her prepared drink from Kurogiri. I didn't know how long it'd take for you to become a lawyer, but of course you'd put in the work to do it. I know I never could have been that patient. Yes, we all know Masaru is patient enough for the both of you, 𝗃 said, nudging Mitsuki in the side and laughing. Mitsuki just scoffed. Meanwhile, Masaru covered his mouth, trying to stifle his laugh. His wife glared daggers at him, but she couldn't help her own smirk. 𝗃 wrapped up the final dish and began setting things out on the table. Izuku, Katsuki, dinner is ready, she called down the hallway, though she knew Kurogiri's miniature portal probably carried her voice to them far better. The two kids came barreling out of Izuku's bedroom, taking a seat at the table. The 𝗃𝗃𝐤𝐮 sat next to their son, and 𝗃 took the open seat next to Izuku. One seat was left empty, as always. Hasashi may never be free to attend these dinners, but he always had a seat at the table, just in case. What about Kurogiri? Mitsuki asked, glancing between 𝗃 and the warper. I actually must be off. I have some errands to run before the night is over, Kurogiri said. He bowed to them. It was a pleasure to finally meet you, Mitsuki, Masaru. He then looked at Izuku. I will see you after school on Monday, young master. Izuku nodded at him, smiling. Bye, Kurogiri. Pleasure to meet you as well, Kurogiri, Mitsuki said. She didn't miss Kurogiri's use of young master when talking to Izuku. Kurogiri gave Izuku one final look before the mist making up his body billowed into a portal, then collapsed in on itself. Kurogiri was there one moment, then gone the next, and he'd taken his bar cart with him. The 𝗃𝗃𝐤𝐮 just gaped at the spot Kurogiri once stood in. 𝗃 and Izuku laughed at the sight. It's his quirk, Izuku said. It's super fun. No wonder you chose him as Izuku's babysitter. If anything goes wrong, he can be at a hospital or police station in an instant, Mitsuki said once she'd gotten over the shock of watching Kurogiri disappear. I can never win hide and seek against him, Izuku pouted. He finds me so fast. That caused the entire table, except little Katsuki, to laugh. Master, are you sure it is wise to leave so many quirks behind? The doctor asked as All for One added a label to the glass vial he held. Along the wall was a rack of dozens of vials, all labeled with a different quirk. These quirks are trivial compared to the ones I am keeping, doctor. Though I suppose even those quirks will eventually be added, once either we or Izuku copy them. The rack was split, the vials on one half having blue labels while the other half had yellow labels. All for One added the vial he was holding to an empty spot on the blue side. He tapped it with a finger before turning to regard the doctor. As we know, our method of copying quirks weakens the quirk ever so slightly. But it is noticeable enough by me, which means it could spell disaster if not accounted for. My remaining quirks shall forever be mine. Any copies we make will be what we use for our projects. He paced the lab, looking between the many stasis tanks that held their experiments. No Namo since Kurogiri had been much of a success. The ones that managed to survive the experimentation were practically useless, or were only used for specialty quirks, like Johnny. But they'd slowly been working on a new one, taking their time to let it adapt to the burden of multiple quirks and the body enhancement. That Nama was still a long way off from being usable, but one day, perhaps, it could be used to weaken All Might. The ridiculous #1 hero, All Might, seen as a symbol of peace by all of Japan. held up on a pedestal of his own making, though he always denied it in interviews. All for One scoffed at the idiocy of the populace, but in the end, it was working to his benefit. All Might was seen as the hero who could handle anything and everything, which made other heroes complacent. They figured All Might would take care of the worst threats. That meant that society would fall apart once he was out of the picture, and All for One would step in and take his position as the Demon Lord once more. He'd always found the title humorous, but it had stuck over the past century, and how could he not use the myth of his existence to his advantage? Villains would fall beneath him, ready to serve once they realized he was in fact still alive. Heroes and vigilantes wouldn't stand a chance against him. Not once All Might was gone, and One for All was in his grasp. But for now, he was stuck continuing his reign from the shadows. Though branches of his empire slowly fell to All Might, the damn hero rooting out the deepest parts of the villain underground, he still held plenty of power, though. No one could stand against him when he decided to make a move. Not the heroes, not the Hero Public Safety Commission, not even the government, who probably thought him gone after they'd begged for his help against the Metal Liberation Army a few decades ago. Izuku will have plenty of quirks to copy soon. He will have all the power I do, and more. Our Namu will become an army, unstoppable by any hero. All at our beck and call. All for One grinned. Of course, Master, but young Izuku still needs to grow some more before we bring him into the inner circle, doesn't he? All for One chuckled. Of course, Doctor. He has a few more years to go. His quirk is wonderful, and he's copied some strong quirks, but not until his body is more developed can he have the essential quirks. Strength enhancement, longevity, the quirks I've wielded for decades. The doctor hummed in acknowledgement as he returned to working on his computer, tapping away at keys. Though a moment later he stopped, the sudden lack of noise drawing All for One's attention. Doctor, he asked, walking over to peer down at the computer monitor in front of the short man. It seems All Might found another of our minions, the doctor said, pulling up a video that showed a raid, led by All Might, on what looked like an abandoned warehouse. All for One pursed his lips for a moment before waving it off. They were small, only used for distraction. I do believe I will be needing to deal with All Might soon, however. Pity, it's been fun watching the man try so hard to find me and fail again and again. Shimura Nana would be so proud of the hero he's become. Such a shame she couldn't live to see it. He grinned evilly. I will take my time ripping that idiot apart. He works alone, despite having that agency. Do you think he's chosen a successor at all? Huh. All for One bellowed a laugh. I heavily doubt it. I know he thinks he's strong enough to stop me. He claims he has any time mention of me is brought up in interviews and press conferences. Reporters who ask of you are also often laughed at. So many think you are a myth, or that you died years ago. Indeed, which is perfect for our plans. With only All Might trying to look for us, it has been easy to stay out of the light and work on our projects. The Namu project would be far behind schedule if I was having to deal with heroes anytime I wasn't hidden away in the lab. Plus, I've made a family during the downtime. Since my brother was so adamantly against me, it only makes sense I create a new, supportive family. One that will aid my empire, and be my legacy. Don't tell me you're planning to let yourself die, the doctor said, looking at him, one eyebrow raised. Of course not, Doctor, All for One chuckled. But eventually I will want to expand our reach beyond Japan, and Izuku will take my spot ruling over this country when I do so. So long as we correct that hero worship of his, the doctor pointed out. Yes, All for One said, scowling. I think I will have to find some heroes to make examples of. All for One trailed off, getting lost in thought. Izuku frowned as he read the article on his phone. Another hero had been exposed for being a liar. This one, a low-rank hero Izuku hadn't really even heard of, but was apparently very popular in his city, had been paying people to pretend to be villains. He'd then swoop in to save the day, making him well-loved and causing the HPSC to increase his payments. The more work a hero did, the more they were paid. That was known by everyone. Of course, All Might's rise to fame had put a damper on many heroes, since they'd begun to lose out on money. All Might's mere existence seemed to quash a lot of villainy, which meant less work for the heroes. Add to that the man's undisputed position as the #1 hero for the last several years. And Izuku could see why some heroes had taken to bribing less than good people into pretending to be villains. The article continued on to report that the hero not only bribed the villains, but also paid for their legal representation as well as bail through a shell corporation. In the past few years, Izuku had come across more and more articles reporting on cases just like this, and apparently, even his mom had been dealing with lawsuits brought against lesser heroes abusing their power. He didn't know how to feel about all that. He loved heroes, don't get him wrong, but all these heroes who turned out to be fakes, they didn't help society's view of heroes as a whole. All Might seemed to be the only one who kept the hope for heroes going. Of course, most of the other top heroes were also still well-liked, though Endeavor was. Izuku had begun to notice the faces his parents and 𝗂𝐤𝐬𝐿 made whenever he mentioned All Might, and so had stopped bringing the hero up. He still collected all kinds of hero merchandise and kept up with the number one's antics on the hero forums he frequented. But he didn't like upsetting his parents, and his father had made it clear more than once that he didn't take kindly to Izuku acting against his wishes. So he didn't talk about heroes too much around them anymore. He continued to read the article as he left school. He was in his first year at 𝐒𝐬𝐴 Junior High. It had been 8 years since his quirk manifested. But he still pretended to be quirkless, per his parents' rules. The bullying hadn't really changed since elementary school. Kaken still harassed him. The occasional lackey of the blonde sometimes took things too far, but Izuku wasn't surprised when they got suspended shortly after. Yet somehow they always continued the bullying when they returned. Kaken had learned to toe the line, able to stay out of trouble while still making Izuku's life miserable. The nickname Deku had stuck, and that's all he was known as to everyone in school, besides the teachers. They looked at him with fear, probably because of his dad. He'd slowly been able to learn about his dad's true identity. His name had changed multiple times, but the description of a quirk that could give and take other quirks was pretty unique, and it showed up in articles dating back to the earliest days of quirks, rare as those articles were. His dad was as old as quirks themselves, and that just amazed Izuku. He didn't quite understand why Hisashi hadn't explained that at all since revealing the truth of his quirk, all for one. But it explained so much, particularly why his dad wielded so many quirks. He'd said he held on to quirks from people who died, and so his living since the dawn of quirks provided background as to why he could have so many of those. Of course, he'd also said he'd taken quirks from people who didn't deserve them, which Izuku thought was kind of cruel, but if it made society safer, then he couldn't really complain, could he? And to the point that most old articles that Izuku managed to find labeled his dad as a villain. Well, the modern terms of hero and villain really only came into prominence in the last 50 years or so who knows what they'd considered a villain back during the early days of quirks. His dad hadn't shown even up in articles at all in the last few decades, so he couldn't be a villain. Izuku did come across a few interviews with All Might which had mentioned All for One, and the number one hero had always said he was still hunting for that villain. But why would All Might be hunting Izuku's dad? It didn't make sense. Despite that, Izuku still somewhat liked the number one hero. Izuku, a baritone voice called, pulling Izuku from his thoughts and his focus on the article on his phone. Oh, hey Kurogiri. I thought Mom and Dad were meeting me today because we were going shopping for my birthday. Izuku asked, tilting his head in confusion. They've been held up and will meet us at your home. They send their apologies. Oh, okay, Izuku said, slightly disappointed. But he always enjoyed the company of Kurogiri, so it wasn't too much of a letdown. No matter how busy his parents were, they always made time on his birthday so they could spend it together. How was school today? Kurogiri asked him as they began the walk home. The warper still refused to use his quirk, or let Izuku use his copy of it, to portal themselves home. He always explained that the walking was better, especially since it was a short trek. Fine, like usual, Izuku said, shrugging. He pulled on his backpack, readjusting the straps. Tsubasa tried to bother me. Did he now? Perhaps we will have to inform the doctor that his grandson is misbehaving. I guess, Izuku said, not having any real feelings about it. He was used to the harassment, though he was surprised the grandson of Dr. Tsubasa would be so mean. He guessed the younger Tsubasa was in the same boat as him, unable to know the truth about his grandfather's work. Izuku had a more direct connection to it, but since Tsubasa just had a winged quirk, he didn't expect Dr. Tsubasa or Hisashi saw any reason to include the boy at all. His phone buzzed, so he pulled it back out from his pocket after having stowed it away when Kurogiri called to him. It was a notification of a hero-villain fight. He kept tabs on those since he'd started his analysis notebooks, writing all about both heroes and villains, and trying to find time to see any altercation live. Of course, his parents weren't thrilled about that, which is why Kurogiri still often met him after school to walk him home. The news blurb said it was a fight between All Might and some unnamed villain. Izuku figured it would be a quick fight, but when he pulled up the live feed of it, he saw a massive amount of carnage, something he'd never expected to see when it came to All Might. Kurogiri, I know you don't like him, but do you have any idea why All Might would have trouble fighting a villain? Izuku asked, shoving his phone towards the warper. Kurogiri stiffened, glancing down at the phone and narrowing his eyes. I'm sure it's nothing, young master. It was probably a tough fight for some other hero before All Might arrived. I doubt it will be anything of substance in the end. You know that some villains are quite good at causing havoc. Yeah, I guess, Izuku said, frowning slightly and pulling his phone back to continue watching the live video. Except, the live feed abruptly stopped, the news anchor saying the issue had been resolved and it was just some villain named Toxic Chainsaw, which Izuku recognized. But he didn't see that villain making such a mess of a city block like the brief video he'd seen had shown. Lost in thought, Izuku missed the frantic texting Kurogiri began to do. He also didn't notice that they'd sped up their pace from their usual slow stroll. How had All Might found him? How had the idiot even known what he looked like anymore? He'd changed his appearance throughout the years, never staying the same as he took down each consecutive wielder of One for All. But here the man was, standing before him and his wife, calling him out for who he truly was. 𝗏𝗏 glared daggers at the hero. He'd find it humorous if 𝗏𝗏 wasn't in so much danger at that moment. Police were evacuating the street they were on, confused civilians being escorted away from what would undoubtedly be a massive battle. 𝗏𝗏, you need to run, he told her. But, 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗍, she started. No, he bellowed, whipping around to her. We both know how this fight will end. I hadn't planned for it to happen today, of all days, nor with you or our son around. Thankfully, Izuku is safe for the time being. I can't send you away, since the warping quirk I have only brings people to me. I'll call 𝗂𝐤𝐺, 𝗏𝗏 said, hastily pulling out her phone from her purse and attempting to dial the warper. She stared at her phone. They're blocking signal. She looked back at him. I can't call 𝗂𝐤𝐺 or the doctor. Shit, he mumbled. Get back in the store. I'll do my best to protect it, but try to shelter yourself the best you can. 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗍, what about Izuku? He has 𝗂𝐤𝐺, who I'm sure will work with the doctor to figure out something. We already had to send 𝗂𝐤𝐺 to pick up Izuku, so he won't be alone. But the news, 𝗏𝗏 said, pointing to the helicopters above. You'll be on TV soon, if we aren't already. This kind of confrontation won't be truly live, he explained. The police will have made sure of that. Society today has almost no clue who I am, and they want to keep it that way. They'll make up some lie once this is all over. It will be interesting to see how they spin the death of All Might. 𝗏𝗏 leaned in and kissed him on the cheek. Good luck, 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗍. Stay safe, 𝗏𝗏, all for one said, not taking his eyes off of All Might. He heard 𝗏𝗏's heels click as she hurried back into the store they'd just come from. They'd been out shopping for Izuku and had lost track of time, failing to be back home before the boy would be getting out of school. It was the first time they'd missed picking up Izuku on his birthday. He'd have to make it up to his son later. This is the end, all for one, All Might bellowed. There's nowhere to run, and I will put a stop to you today. All for one couldn't help but grin. Just like your master. She thought she could stop me, but you saw how that ended for her. Are you really here for a repeat of that, Toshinori? Shall I remind you of Shimura's screams as I killed her? No, I'm sure I don't have to. You relive that day over and over in your nightmares, don't you? All Might's signature smile was missing. Not surprising. In its place was a snarl, which brought great joy to All for One. His mere existence wiped that ridiculous smile off the idiot's face. Shut up, All Might growled out. I won't fail to stop you. Sure you won't, All for One said. It's not like I've never heard those words before. He called on the battle-oriented quirks he'd been stockpiling for decades, the ones he refused to leave with the doctor except as inferior copies. The quirks he planned to have Izuku copy on his 16th birthday, when he'd reveal to the boy the legacy he was growing into. It was disappointing that he'd have to destroy the hero that had interested Izuku for so long, but the boy would understand. All Might was the only one who stood in their way, and with him gone, and One for All back in his control, no one would be able to stop them. All Might leapt at him, winding back an arm to land a punch on him. He shrugged off the blow, a shockwave blasting out from the contact. All for One strengthened his own arm and hit All Might, sending the hero flying back into the office building across the street. Taking a moment, All for One created a barrier in front of the store 𝗏𝗏 was hiding and using air wall. It would reinforce the building so that his clash with All Might wouldn't put it at risk of collapse. His momentary distraction allowed All Might to run in and land a hit against his back. He flew down the street, but righted himself and turned to glare at the hero. I didn't figure you want to care about collateral damage. All for One, All Might said, nodding to the air wall. Going soft. Ha, you would like that, wouldn't you? All for One asked. He fired black lighting at All Might, who managed to dodge it. The lightning hit a car, causing it to explode and send shrapnel across the street. The police had done their job well in escorting civilians away from the battle zone. Without anyone else around, All Might had no one to worry about protecting. His focus was solely on All for One. All Might drew back, calling out his ridiculous attack. Detroit Smash. A massive column of air rocketed at All for One. He just sighed and fired his own blast of air with air cannon. The two air columns collided, causing a massive gust of wind to blow out from the epicenter. Glass broke on the buildings around them. Cars skidded from their abandoned spots on the street. All for One just shrugged off the gale, as did All Might. The hero rushed in again, aiming a punch at All for One. Was that really all the man could do? All for One drew on several quirks, strengthening, enlarging, and reinforcing his right arm. He met All Might's fist with his own, and once more a shockwave was released as they clashed. This was a fight between two titans, and All for One was merely toying with the hero, getting his hopes up that maybe, just maybe, he could actually win. And when All Might got cocky, All for One would bring down the hammer and end the hero's miserable and pointless life. They continued to clash in this manner, the resulting shockwaves slowly chipping at the buildings around them. Occasionally one of them would send the other crashing into a building, causing it to collapse. But both of them would just shove the rubble off their bodies and stand back up to continue the fight. That was until 𝗧𝗵𝗏 dodged an assault by All Might, who instead went flying into the air wall in front of the 𝗧𝗵𝗏. Cracks spiderwebbed out from where All Might had impacted the wall. 𝗧𝗵𝗏 watched as the wall splintered then faded away, the quirk taking too much damage to remain effective. He scowled at All Might, who paid it no mind and ran back at 𝗧𝗵𝗏 again. He grabbed the hero's arm and swung him around, launching him down the street. All Might crashed into a car, yet still the hero stood back up, wiping some blood from his mouth. The man's hero costume was in tatters, but he still fought on. He took a step, then faltered slightly, falling to one knee. Enough of this, 𝗧𝗵𝗏 decreed. I don't normally repeat an execution, but I'm sure your master wouldn't mind that you went out the same way she did. He formed a massive fireball above his head, engorging it with the strength-enhancing quirks he'd picked up over the years. It grew and grew until the heat was nearly unbearable, almost as if it were the sun itself. He launched the fireball at All Might. This had been the way he'd killed 𝗓𝗵𝗏. The screams of the woman as she'd been burned alive had brought him great pleasure. 𝗧𝗵𝗏 put up an air wall in front of him as the fireball continued on its course to All Might. The hero could only watch as his demise approached. The downside to this move was how slow it moved, but it didn't matter when it was used on a crippled opponent, except in the last moment before the fireball would have been close enough to begin cooking All Might alive. He jumped. He must have put his all into the jump because he soared dozens of meters into the sky, well above the fireball. 𝗧𝗵𝗏 dropped his air wall and sent out a blast from air cannon to dissipate the fireball. There was no use in its collateral damage if it didn't do its main job. The blast of air hit the fireball in its center, creating a hole in it. The ball then collapsed in on itself and sent a blast of heat out in all directions as it fizzled away. All Might came barreling back to the ground, right at 𝗧𝗵𝗏. He dodged to the side as the hero blasted past him, right into the only remaining, intact building on the street. The store all but exploded, concrete blasting away from All Might's impact as the building collapsed. 𝗧𝗵𝗏's eyes widened as he flew towards the rubble. He funneled more power into his arm and grabbed All Might once more, launching him down the street until he was out of sight. He scrambled to lift the rubble, searching. As he lifted a piece of the store's roof, he saw an outstretched, bloody hand sticking out of a pile of concrete chunks. Quickly removing the pile, he was met with the sight of his wife, bloody and crumpled. He didn't need a quirk to know she was dead. Her body bent in ways it shouldn't be. He roared in anguish and anger. Fury burned deep inside him, and he whipped around to glare down the street he'd thrown All Might. The hero was there, running back down the street, as if he hadn't just been thrown several blocks. 𝗧𝗵𝗏 sincerely hoped there'd still been civilians where All Might had landed, and that the resulting crater from the hero's impact had caused some casualties. You won't stop me that easily, All Might bellowed as he launched attack after attack on 𝗧𝗵𝗏. 𝗧𝗵𝗏 could tell All Might knew he was backed into a corner. His punches were thrown with reckless abandon, and with more strength than he'd ever seen the hero use. But in turn, 𝗧𝗵𝗏 launched attacks back. This area of the city would be leveled beyond belief before their battle ended. As he fought back, landing hits against All Might, 𝗧𝗵𝗏 failed to notice how reckless he was also being. He was leaving himself open to easy hits, which All Might took advantage of. The hero grabbed his head and began to crush it between his hands. 𝗧𝗵𝗏 screamed, blasting All Might back with air cannon and launching dark balls of explosive energy after the hero. His head was bleeding and he could tell his skull had been fractured. He'd never had this much trouble fighting off a wielder of One for All, and didn't expect All Might to be any different, even with the stockpiling power of One for All. One of his dark balls landed a hit against All Might's side, burning the hero's flesh. It made an easy target for a follow-up attack. 𝗧𝗵𝗏 took that opportunity and launched himself at All Might, grabbing the man's side in his hand and crushing it. The hero yelled in agony and 𝗧𝗵𝗏 grinned. "You've lost," he said, holding the hero up. "Your quirk will be mine, and this useless legacy of resistance will finally be over. But I'll take my time killing you." All Might roared and slammed his fists together, right on each side of 𝗧𝗵𝗏's head. Japan's greatest supervillain collapsed in a heap, choking on blood as brain matter spilled from his crushed skull. His sight was gone, his hearing barely there, but he could feel All Might nearby. He could tell when the hero stood back up, limping over to him. In one last-ditch attempt to kill the hero and save himself, he unleashed a blast of power from his body, sending the hero flying. It was then he realized he wasn't choking on his blood, but rather the black sludge of his warp quirk, of Johnny's warp quirk. The cold feeling of the sludge overtook him, and he lost consciousness before even arriving at the lab. Izuku frowned as he padded out into the living room again. He'd been home for a few hours, but still his parents hadn't shown up, and 𝗂𝐞𝐤𝐵 had been pacing nearly the entire time. Izuku had never seen the warper anxious before. "𝗂𝐞𝐤𝐵," he said, causing the warper to stiffen. "I thought you said Mom and Dad would be here not long after we got home." But it's been a few hours. Young Master, 𝗓𝐞𝐤𝐮 started, but paused as his phone rang. He pulled it out and answered. Yes, doctor, I see. Yes, we'll be there in just a moment. He put the phone away and turned to Izuku. We've been summoned to the lab, Izuku. But before we go, I must warn you. Something has happened to your parents. Izuku couldn't help the tears that welled behind his eyes. He could only think of the worst possible things that could have happened. He took 𝗓𝐞𝐤𝐮's outstretched hand as the man made them a portal. They walked through and arrived in the doctor's lab where the man was intensely working on someone on the surgical bed at the back. He had a few of the weaker Namu nearby, ones Izuku realized as having medical-related quirks. Doctor, we are here, 𝗓𝐞𝐤𝐮 said. Good, good, Dr. Tsubasa said, not turning from his patient. He's been asking for Izuku. Quickly, explain the situation, then bring him here. 𝗓𝐞𝐤𝐮 turned, then knelt down in front of Izuku. Young Master, your parents were attacked earlier today, shortly after I picked you up from school. Izuku stared through 𝗓𝐞𝐤𝐮 as his thoughts ran a mile a minute. His eyes widened when he remembered what else had happened right after school. All Might. Yes, I lied to you earlier, 𝗓𝐞𝐤𝐮 said. That battle was not just some random villain. That was a fated fight between All Might and your father. All for One and All Might, or rather the quirk he possesses, have been rivals since the dawn of quirks. And each time the quirk All Might has passed from user to user, All for One has hunted them down to take back what is rightfully his. Today, instead of All for One doing that, he was the one hunted down. He and All Might fought, which caused the devastation you saw on the news. And that is why the news was cut off. The government and HPSC do not wish for the public to know of All for One and All Might's past. The fight did not go well. Is that? Izuku tried to say, but his voice cracked and got stuck in his throat. Tears flowed freely down his cheeks now. The doctor is working on your father, trying to save his life. But I'm afraid your mother did not make it. She was crushed by a falling building. Mom, Izuku cried, collapsing to his knees. Izuku, a raspy voice called from the surgical bed. Izuku shot up, recognizing it as his dad's voice. Dad. Izuku ran to the bedside. He was met with the gruesome sight of his father, beaten and bloody, his head caved in. His eyes were gone, and the doctor worked on the rest of the man's head. Izuku, little one, Hisashi said weakly. I need you to copy my quirk. Copy All for One. Izuku didn't understand, but he did as he was told, just like he always did. He reached out with his quirk and searched for the right thread. Except, it wasn't a thread. It was practically a rope. It glowed and writhed within Hisashi. Izuku pulled on it, a deep red ball of energy forming in his open palm. He closed his hand, absorbing the quirk he'd never been allowed to touch until now. Now, use it. Use your copy of All for One, and take the real quirk from me. Hisashi commanded, his voice barely a whisper. Then give me the copy. But Dad, it's your quirk. Why take a copy of it? Because, Hisashi wheezed, I don't know when I'll be able to leave this lab again, if ever. And this quirk is your legacy. Make the world pay for what it's done to you, to our family. Izuku cried as he used his copy of All for One to pull the original out of his father. Then using the original, he placed the copy back into its original owner. Very good, little one, Hisashi said. Now, 𝗓𝐞𝐤𝐮 will take care of you. I hope to see you again one day. The doctor he'll do his best to heal me. One day, we'll be together again, and we'll make the world ours. Daddy, Izuku cried, tears streaming down his face. He felt like a little kid again. Not the 13-year-old teenager he now was. What a horrible birthday gift the world had given him. Hisashi weakly rested a hand on Izuku's cheek, using his thumb to wipe away the tears. Go, little one, live for me and your mother, until I return. Hisashi's hand fell away from Izuku's cheek as he passed out. No, Dad, don't leave me. 𝗓𝐞𝐤𝐮, take him away. I need to focus on my work again if we have any hope of saving Master's life. The doctor ordered. 𝗓𝐞𝐤𝐮 had to drag Izuku from his father's body. He warped them back to the Midoriya apartment. Izuku continued to cry into 𝗓𝐞𝐤𝐮's chest. The warper just held him, rubbing his back and whispering useless platitudes to try and calm the boy down. Eventually, Izuku fell asleep in 𝗓𝐞𝐤𝐮's arms. 𝗓𝐞𝐤𝐮 carried the boy to his bed and laid him down. He then took a seat at Izuku's desk, not planning to let Izuku out of his sight. Izuku didn't wake up until the next day, entirely forgetting about his birthday, though he'd never feel the urge to celebrate it again. It had gone from one of the best days every year to the absolute worst in his life. When he did wake up, he felt hollow. His parents were gone. Even if his dad survived the surgery, neither he nor the doctor thought he'd wake up anytime soon. The late morning sun shined through his curtains, lighting up his room. He sat up and stared at the wall. He could hear rustling from elsewhere in the apartment, and for a brief moment he almost thought everything had been a terrible nightmare, and he'd walk out to find his mom cooking breakfast like usual. But the all-for-one quirk pulsed in his soul, and he knew that it had all been very, very real. He got out of bed, realizing he was still wearing his 𝐒𝐬𝐬 junior high uniform from the day before. He frowned down at the clothes and quickly changed out of them into a pair of sweatpants and a random shirt. An All Might shirt lay on the floor. He snatched it up and tossed it through a quick portal, sending it to a garbage dump nearby. Out in the kitchen, 𝗂𝐤𝐺 was diligently making breakfast. He'd done it plenty of times before, so it wasn't necessarily an odd thing to see. But it still made Izuku's heart ache. "Good morning, young master," 𝗂𝐤𝐺 said as Izuku padded into the kitchen. He'd made coffee, which Izuku usually wasn't allowed to have, but the warper didn't stop him when he grabbed a mug and filled it with the dark, bitter liquid. "Is it?" Izuku snapped. "I suppose not. I apologize." Izuku sighed. "No, sorry, 𝗂𝐤𝐺. You're just trying to keep things going like normal. All we can do is continue on," 𝗂𝐤𝐺 said, plating up some eggs and pancakes for Izuku. "Eat. You haven't had food since lunch yesterday." Izuku looked down at the outstretched plate of food and his stomach rumbled. He took it, nodding in thanks, and walked over to the dining table. He began to eat, honestly surprised he had an appetite at all. "May I speak freely?" 𝗂𝐤𝐺 asked him, stepping out of the kitchen with his own mug of coffee. "Yeah, always," Izuku said between mouthfuls of food. "I understand that this is a terrible tragedy to live through. But as I said, we need to continue on. I will be taking care of you from now on. However, we need to move out of this apartment. It's only a matter of time before the police look into your family due to your mother's death. I've already packed up many of your things. We won't fully abandon the apartment, but we cannot stay here for the foreseeable future." Izuku frowned. He figured as much. Things were vastly different now. He'd been let in on the truth of his father. Those old articles he'd found were evidently right. Hisashi was a villain. But that didn't change Izuku's opinion of the man. He was still Izuku's dad, and always would be. "Okay," Izuku said. "We can leave the hero merch. I don't feel any attachment to it anymore." 𝗂𝐤𝐺 tilted his head. "You and your mother were always so alike. You both got emotional over the simplest of things, which Master found endearing. But now you seem so much more like your father, able to accept the reality of things and move forward. I do believe both of your parents would be even more proud of you than they already were." "Thanks, 𝗂𝐤𝐺," Izuku said, sniffling a bit, though no tears threatened his eyes. "That honestly means a lot." 𝗂𝐤𝐺 nodded. After breakfast, "We will move to one of the nearby safe houses Master had set up. It's cozy, as he once put it. It was meant as a backup home in case something happened and your family had to leave this one in a hurry." "Will they have a funeral for my mom?" Izuku asked, sitting back in his chair. He'd finished eating by this point. "Most likely. Even if the authorities connect her to Master, the 𝗵𝘃𝐤𝐺 would never let them slander your mother. Mitsuki will most likely fight the authorities on that, claiming that 𝗃𝐞 would have never been with someone like 𝗚𝗏 had she known who he was," 𝗂𝐤𝐺 said. "We'll have to keep up that facade in order to keep you out of trouble." "I understand. Will I still be going to 𝐒𝐴LDURA?" "Yes, besides the move, your life will have to continue on as if nothing has changed, which means I have to continue hiding my quirk." "Correct, especially now that you also wield the original 𝗚𝗏. I'm sorry, young master. I know you wish you could show off your quirk." Izuku pondered his options for the future while 𝗂𝐤𝐺 cleaned up from breakfast. He hand-washed all the dishes and utensils they'd used, putting everything away so that the apartment remained clean. The warper had been cleaning and organizing the home all night. "𝗂𝐤𝐺," Izuku suddenly said, drawing the warper's attention back to him. "My dad, he dealt with anyone and everyone who went against him, right? Hero, villain, even vigilantes." "Correct," 𝗂𝐤𝐺 said, his eyes narrowing. He didn't seem to like where this was going. What if I become a pseudo-vigilante? Though I'll probably be labeled a villain. But Mom, Dad, even you were right about heroes. They aren't inherently good just because society labels them as such, and I have the ability to stop them easily." "You do, but you can't draw too much attention to yourself, young master. If the authorities catch you, yeah, I know, but if I can do something, shouldn't I?" Izuku asked. "And I won't go after high-profile heroes or anything. But you and I both know that with the fall of someone like my dad, so many people will try to show up and fill the power vacuum. Just because the news won't report on the truth doesn't mean that the underworld won't know what's happened." 𝗂𝐤𝐺 was surprised. He hadn't expected Izuku to be so intelligent when it came to the workings of the villain underworld. He set down the dish towel he was holding and walked back over to stand next to the dining room table, looking down at Izuku. "You are right. Many of Master's former connections will turn on him and attempt to take some of the power he's left behind. The doctor and I were left with contingency plans to keep some semblance of control, but you may be correct in that you can, and should, do something to assist." "Contingency? Like the other kid Dad had you watch over. How do you know of him?" "Well, Dad and the doctor weren't exactly subtle when they discussed him, and they did that plenty when I was at the lab for quirk training or to assist their experiments." 𝗃𝐴LDUR hummed. "Shigaraki Tamura is his name. His quirk is destructive, and he was in an abusive household before he accidentally destroyed it. Master found him one day, when you were very little, and took him in. The doctor and I have been the ones to supervise him since Master had you to focus on. He has a role to play in the future. Master wants him as the temporary face of the remnants of his empire. Until, of course, you are able to step into that role. Right, Izuku said, looking down at his lap. I think I want to try my plan for now. Can you, or the doctor, get me some kind of costume to help hide my identity? Easily. The simplest idea would be for an all-black outfit, which includes a hood and mask. Nothing too flashy. And you could look like any normal teenager roaming the streets. It wouldn't draw too much attention. Yeah, that sounds good, Izuku said. He stood up from the table. I'm gonna go shower and change, then we can leave. He looked around the apartment, taking it in one last time before he finished preparing for their move. They didn't know when they'd be coming back, but at least it would still be here whenever they were able to return. Very well, young master. Once we settle in at the new house, we can go speak with the doctor and see about getting you some more combat-oriented quirks, Kurogiri said. Your fitness training will be very useful going forward. Izuku nodded as he walked down the hallway. He'd hated the workouts his dad always made him do. But in the end they'd been useful, just as the man had told him whenever Izuku wanted to give up. He'd have to learn hand-to-hand on his own, but with the speed he picked up new things, he doubted it'd be too hard. He went into the bathroom and organized the things he'd take with him, his toothbrush and toothpaste, his hairbrush. The rest of the shower supplies he could leave behind. Besides, he didn't really want to have to pack up wet things anyway, since he was about to shower. Once he'd finished his shower and gotten dressed, he grabbed a duffel bag of things he wanted to take with him and met Kurogiri in the living room. Unsurprisingly, they weren't walking to the safe house, they were warping there. Kurogiri had already taken the suitcases he'd packed for Izuku and now stood waiting on the teen. Izuku stepped through the portal, which Kurogiri collapsed as they exited on the other side. The safe house was certainly cozy, as the warper claimed Hisashi had called it. It wasn't much different from their original apartment. Of course, it looked far less lived in, but Hisashi and 𝗏𝗏 most likely had done their best to ensure this could be a backup home for them all. You'll be pleased to know this place has a secret room, which you can use for your escapades, Kurogiri said. He pulled up a floor plan of the apartment and showed it to Izuku. In the middle was a room that only had one entrance, a fake wall in the master bedroom. Coordinates marked a spot in the middle of the hidden room. For warping, Izuku asked, pointing at the coordinates. Kurogiri nodded. That's pretty cool. Kurogiri's eyes brightened, indicating a smile. Make yourself comfortable, get moved in and settle. As you probably guessed, you're excused from school for the remainder of the week, but you'll need to begin attending again on Monday. All right, thanks Kurogiri, Izuku said, heading to one of the smaller bedrooms. He wasn't about to take the master bedroom. It would feel weird, and even though his parents would never be able to use it, it still felt like it was theirs. Izuku unpacked his things once he chose a room. His clothes were neatly put away in the dresser and closet. Then he pulled out his stack of notebooks. All hero analysis. Before, he'd noted this information down because he found it interesting. He liked quirks, regardless of the fact his own incentivized learning others, and heroes had always seemed like good people before. Now these were useful for finding ways to stop the heroes. And he'd add to it with villains, whose information he'd get from Kurogiri and the doctor. Vigilantes would be harder, but he could look into them while doing his own work. He never expected to become a vigilante villain at only 13. But he had a legacy to live up to, didn't he? The apartment was abandoned, yet it looked as if the residents had just stepped out for a bit, the detective said, almost as if we just happened to miss them. Are you sure they didn't? The hero asked. He was tired, like always, and sitting in the detective's office was making him want to just sleep, seeing as one of the known residents had her funeral a few days ago, and the other is Mia. Yes, I'm quite sure. Aizawa Shouta, the underground pro-hero, Eraserhead, sighed. He picked up the file in front of him and opened it to read about the case. Midoriya Izuku's crushed body was discovered in the aftermath of a massive hero-villain fight, which somehow Aizawa knew almost nothing about, and Detective 𝗧𝗏𝗏 Naomosa wasn't giving him any details about it either. Midoriya Izuku had been a well-respected lawyer, though the cases she focused on centered around heroes abusing their power. The woman's husband, Midoriya Hisashi, didn't have much information on him. He had a lot of travel paperwork, though. Based on those records, Hisashi had barely been home. Instead, he spent time in other prefectures, and even out of the country. Then, of course, was their son, Midoriya Izuku. The boy had disappeared for a few days following the death of his mother, but he'd returned to school the following week and even showed up at Izuku's funeral, according to the file. According to the police, Midoriya had been taken in by the babysitter he'd had as a kid, though nothing much was known about the man. Family friends of the Midoriyas, the 𝗏𝗃𝗧𝗏, had confirmed as much, but they also said they hadn't seen Izuku since his mother's death, except briefly at the woman's funeral. Their only other knowledge of the teen was the fact their own son attended the same school as him, 𝐒𝐴LDRA Junior High. So, Aizawa said, leaning back in his chair, why exactly did you call me down here? Something doesn't add up, 𝗧𝗏𝗁𝐷 said. The location Mrs. Midoriya died, the fight that happened there and her possible connections to the villain, about whom you'll tell me nothing, Aizawa reminded him. Not my call, sorry, the detective said. All I can say is that he was an extremely dangerous man, and if she was connected to him in any way, then their son needs to be watched. As far as we can tell, they live in an area of the city which you patrol anyway, so if you can just keep an eye out and let us know if you discover anything, it'd be much appreciated. Aizawa sighed. Fine, but you know I can only watch. Just because you have a suspicion doesn't mean I can grab the kid and detain him or anything. Yeah, I know. All I want is an eye on him. I'll let you know if anything interesting happens. But my guess is that this Midoriya is just going to be a mourning teenager trying to continue his life as best he can. I'm hoping you're right, the detective said. Throwing up his hood, Izuku formed a portal with warp. Black-green mist flowed from his hand to create the swirling mass. He walked through it, stepping out of the hidden room in his home and into an alleyway several blocks away. He and 𝗂𝐤𝐵 had quickly decided there was no point in keeping their new home a secret, since Izuku still had to go to school and he couldn't just warp to and from 𝐒𝐴LDHR every day. Plus, the police had come to talk to him about the death of his mother 3 times now, as if he had anything new to tell them after the first one. Though it had given him the chance to learn the quirk of Detective 𝗧𝗏𝗁𝗏, which he discreetly copied one day when walking them out of the apartment after the interrogation. The truth was a fickle thing. One could manipulate their wording to come across as true to even the strictest of lie detectors. In addition, if someone believed wholeheartedly that they were speaking the truth, then it would ping as such. 𝗂𝐤𝐵 and the doctor had helped Izuku learn how to best fool a lie detector quirk. Though Izuku was still careful in what he said and how he worded things, he preferred half-truths rather than attempting to lie in such a fashion that it seemed like he was telling the truth. Regardless of what he'd become, or who his father had been, Izuku couldn't fully bear lying to the authorities. Rolling his shoulders, Izuku absorbed the warp mist back into his body, and a moment later his hand was once again corporeal and solid. He shook it, since the feeling of using warp always left him with a sense of pins and needles for a few minutes after. He was after one specific villain tonight, someone whose quirk was extremely powerful, though the man barely knew the half of it. The doctor had discovered it thanks to some of the connections they still had with the underworld. The villain had a quirk that they'd labeled amnesia. It allowed the user to erase a victim's memory, to varying degrees if they were correct. But the villain only used it to make people forget him and his actions after he'd had his fun. He used it short-term. Izuku figured it could be used to entirely erase someone's memory of a person, regardless of how long they'd known them. The quirk would allow him to make people forget him, as needed. It would primarily be useful for anyone he came across on these night patrols, as he'd come to call them. But it could also be used to wipe the memory of people who'd known him longer, if he saw the need. At this point, that only really included his classmates at 𝗎𝗓 and the Bakugo family. He didn't want to wipe their memories, but if he did follow in his father's footsteps, it might be necessary. At the very least, he had discussed with the doctor about wiping the Bakugo's memory of 𝗂𝐤𝐵, given the warper was now focusing on taking care of Shigaraki. Izuku used airwalk to make his way to the nearby rooftop. Warping into alleys limited the chance someone would notice the portal, but the rooftops were beneficial to scouting. He understood why many heroes used the same strategy. According to their intel, the villain he was after frequented this part of the city due to its many bars and nightclubs, because his targets were the drunk patrons leaving those establishments. Sometimes he just took their money. Other times, he did more unsavory things to them. And in the end, he'd cause them to forget the horror they experienced that night. And so he continued to be uncaught by the authorities. He scanned the street below, on which were 3 different nightclubs. People flowed in and out of each, moving between them with friends, or whoever they'd met in one club. Izuku had been given a quirk that heightened his vision at night, and so he could easily make out what each person looked like. It took about 30 minutes before Izuku saw a man that fit the description they'd been given. He was following another young man out of one of the clubs, staying back a few feet. The civilian was nearly stumbling as he walked, obviously drunk, which made him the exact target the villain was going for. Izuku followed them from the rooftops, waiting for his opportunity. The villain wouldn't act while they were still so close to the crowds of the club, but a few blocks away he finally sped up to catch the young man. Izuku took that moment to run down to street level, using airwalk, and tackle the villain into an alley. He heard the civilian mutter something, probably having heard the thud of Izuku's body slamming into the villain and taking them both into the alley. But the young man didn't investigate. Footsteps faded away as he kept walking. "What the fuck?" the villain snarled, pushing Izuku off of him and standing up. "Who the hell do you think you are? Huh. Doesn't matter who I am. You'll forget me soon enough." Izuku's mask changed his voice to be deeper, distorted. "Huh." The villain barked out a laugh. "I think it's you who'll forget me, dumbass." The villain took a step towards Izuku, but the teen just cocked his head to the side. He called on the strength quirks the doctor had let him copy shortly after his parents died, and punched the villain, sending him flying into the wall. The villain's breath was knocked out of him as he collapsed to the ground, wheezing. "Yeah, no," Izuku said as he walked over to the villain and knelt in front of him. While his copy quirk only required proximity, all for one required physical contact. He set his hand on the villain's shoulder and pulled the amnesia quirk out of him. "Like I said, you'll forget me." He used the new quirk to erase the villain's mind of the few memories related to Izuku. He then dropped an envelope into the villain's lap as the man fell unconscious, a side effect of the amnesia quirk. Izuku often left these villains for the authorities to find, collecting evidence of their crimes and leaving that as well so they'd get locked up. Low-level villains like this guy weren't worth keeping around, even if their quirks were. A quick phone call to the police, using an untraceable phone 𝗂𝐤𝐵 had given him, and Izuku was done for the night. He used warp to head home. He'd achieved his goal for the night. It had been 6 months since his parents died. Whether or not his father could ever be awoken from his coma, Izuku figured it easier to assume him dead. It made lying about it more believable to others if he just thought that way all the time. School continued to be its normal, annoying part of his life. Bullies continued to harass him, though they dialed it back a bit during the first few weeks after his parents' deaths. But they were back at it in full now. Well, all except 𝗂𝐞𝐤𝐮. 𝗂𝐶𝐤𝐮 didn't bother him much at all anymore, though he still glared and sneered at Izuku and continued calling him a useless Deku. Izuku honestly didn't give a damn what any of them thought. His grades were near perfect. He had more power than any of them could ever imagine. He could probably explode the room, and everyone in it, with ease. But he was still 13, and figured outright murder, especially of children, wasn't the best plan, nor what he really ever wanted to do with the power he held. His father had been a villain, probably the largest and most powerful villain ever known. But Izuku didn't see himself fully following in Hisashi's footsteps. Yeah, for now, he was assisting the doctor in creating Namu, since his copy quirk made it so easy. And maybe he wanted to tear down hero society because of how corrupt it was. But he also didn't want villains running free in the streets, terrorizing civilians. And if he took his father's route, then even with him at the top, that kind of thing was bound to happen. No one could control everything in a society. So, for now, he just continued his nightly escapades. Sometimes he took down villains. Other times he stopped corrupt heroes and left enough evidence behind to get them caught. He'd come across a few vigilantes, who he'd chatted with. He actually rarely saw a need to disrupt them. They were genuinely helping people, and weren't in it for the money like so many heroes, though some of them did go a bit overboard. Izuku hadn't come across any of those guys yet. He ate lunch on the roof of 𝗧𝗪, as had become his norm. He'd slink away when class was dismissed for lunch and warp himself to the top, bypassing the stairwells and any teachers who might be guarding them. He was careful, ensuring no one saw him use the quirk. 𝗂𝐤𝐵 always packed him lunch, though the warper wasn't home all that often anymore. He had those contingency plans to take care of, particularly Shigaraki Tamura, whom Izuku had yet to meet. But based on the doctor's feelings toward Shigaraki, and 𝗂𝐤𝐵's description of him, Izuku wasn't missing out on much. He'd leave them alone, for now. Both men still happily helped Izuku, and in turn he assisted them when they asked. The doctor was the one who took that opportunity the most. The latest Namu experiment had resulted in failure. The focus on ensuring All for One survived his fight with All Might caused the doctor to neglect the stasis pod holding the Namu for several days. The lack of attention had led the pod to failing one day, setting back the project immensely. The doctor had cowered from Izuku when he'd had to explain what happened. Izuku had just stared at him, confused. It took a moment to realize the doctor probably thought Izuku would react like his father and severely punish him. While Izuku wouldn't do that, he made sure the threat of such a possibility still existed. He'd told the doctor he was disappointed in the failure, but understood the reasoning behind it. However, if the doctor failed again, then there would have to be consequences. The old Izuku would have balked at such an action. But the old Izuku also had loving parents who still lived, still hugged him and praised him. This new Izuku didn't have that luxury. The doctor had immediately begun work on a new Namu, with the same focus of having the capability to fight All Might. They hadn't seen nor heard anything of the hero since his fight with All for One. None of them were even sure the man still lived, but given All for One did, they weren't taking any chances. The Namu would be a gift for Shigaraki one day, should the number one hero make a return. Shigaraki had apparently been groomed by the doctor and All for One into hating heroes, All Might most of all. That didn't surprise Izuku. The story of how they'd come to adopt Shigaraki had pinged true when the doctor told him, thanks to the lie detector quirk he'd picked up from Detective 𝗧𝗵𝗲. His phone buzzed and he pulled it out of his pocket to see a text from the doctor. "Doctor, can you stop by the lab after school today? I have something I would like to test with your copies." Izuku had nothing he needed to get done that night, and wasn't planning on heading out to deal with any stupid villains or heroes. So he shrugged as he typed out his response. "Izuku, I'll be there after dinner." He only ever warped to the lab from his home, and so he decided he'd take the time to change out of his uniform and eat dinner before heading into the lab. The doctor wouldn't complain, and his quick reply of thank you was exactly what Izuku expected. Izuku arrived at the lab around 6 o'clock. The doctor greeted him without looking up from his computer. He had a few of the quirk vials arranged nearby, none of them labeled. Izuku could guess what their experiment was going to be tonight. Izuku took a seat on one of the many stools strewn around the lab while he waited on the doctor to tell him why he was there. The latest 𝗵𝗲 project floated in its large stasis tank. The monster was still in its biological augment stage, where the doctor enhanced the body so it could withstand the many quirks it was going to hold. The 𝗵𝗲 still creeped Izuku out, despite his proximity to them for so many years. "Thank you for coming, young master," the doctor said. "I want to see how many copies of a quirk you can create. We know you can make one, and now that you have all for one, you can transfer that copy to someone or something else. But your father was able to wield multiple copies of one quirk. Mainly the strength-boosting ones like the single copies you currently wield. Since we've barely used your copy quirk, which we really should name beyond just copy seeing as that's too basic," the doctor continued, "especially since the failure already has that listed on official documentation." He then muttered under his breath before returning to his normal volume. "We need to test how it functions. Besides all for one and the amnesia quirk. And of course your quirk itself, you only wield copies of quirks. So far, they've all been seen to function exactly the same as the originals, unlike our artificial copies. And if I can make multiple copies, then we can replace your artificial ones?" Izuku asked. "Partially. I do not want to force you to always be available to make copies, and with the amount of originals I have available, thanks to your father, I can make copies for the 𝗵𝗲 without much issue. I will want to test how effective your copies are when it comes to my artificial duplications. Currently, if I copy a copy, the quirk degrades further. It practically becomes useless after 2 copies. Doctor," a voice yelled through the intercom nearby, causing the doctor to sigh aggressively. "The damn brat," the short man mumbled. "Young master, put on your mask and hood. Shigaraki is most likely about to barge in here and demand something." Izuku snorted as he threw up the hood of his sweatshirt and put his mask on. "You should move him out of the compound, then. We're working on it. Kurogiri has been setting up a place to be a front for what we have planned with the brat." The door at the far end of the lab slammed open just as the doctor dimmed the lights on everything beyond the first few meters of the lab. "While he's here," the doctor whispered, "copy his quirk. I have an interest in messing with it. Just don't touch anything while you have it. It's a 5-finger activation." Izuku nodded, following the doctor towards the front of the lab. The only visible things behind them was the doctor's work area and the main 𝗵𝗲 experiment. "Doctor, Kurogiri is not answering me," Shigaraki whined, scratching at his neck. "Because he is busy," the doctor said flatly. "As we've told you, he has other jobs to handle while Master is indisposed." That piqued Izuku's attention. So they hadn't told Shigaraki the truth about all for one yet. "Sensei better have a good reason to be gone so long," Shigaraki snarled. Izuku couldn't help the growl that came from his throat at the careless words of Shigaraki. The other teenager turned to him and glared. "Who are you?" Izuku waited to see if the doctor would explain, but the man just gestured for him to go ahead. "None of your concern," Izuku said lowly, his voice distorted by his mask. He'd just wiped Shigaraki's memory of him with amnesia anyway. The other teen continued to glare at him, narrowing his eyes. Shigaraki took a step forward, putting him in range for Izuku to copy his quirk. So Izuku did. He found the thread and pulled it, the wisp forming in his hand a blue-gray color that matched Shigaraki's hair. He let the wisp float in his palm as it drew Shigaraki's attention. Izuku then absorbed it and clenched both hands into fists, so he couldn't accidentally touch anything with all 5 fingers. He could tell it was a destruction quirk, based on how it felt. That was dangerous for someone as volatile as Shigaraki. He had to wonder how many things the teenager had destroyed, either accidentally or purposefully. The hell was that? Shigaraki demanded. "Go back to your room," the doctor ordered. "Kurogiri will return soon to take you to the location he's been setting up. I'm sure you'll be much happier there." Shigaraki scoffed and turned to leave, but before he walked away, Izuku quickly wiped his memory of meeting Izuku. The teen shook his head, dazed, before collapsing. "Ah, right, that quirk knocks them unconscious," the doctor said, staring down at Shigaraki. "We'll deal with him in a moment. First, come here." Izuku followed him over to his desk, where the doctor picked up one of the quirk containment vials. He quickly wrote on it 𝗃, then held it up for Izuku. "Put that quirk in here. 1 finger on the vial should be enough to transfer it." Izuku tapped his index finger against the vial, pulling 𝗃 from his stockpile of quirks and placing it into the artificial environment within the vial. The glass glowed a dull blue as the doctor placed it in the rack alongside the other copies. The doctor then handed Izuku a piece of blank paper. Just to be safe, take this and touch it with all 5 fingers of one hand. Izuku did, and nothing happened. They waited a minute or so to be sure. All right, now if you could, please warp Shigaraki back to his room. The doctor pulled up a diagram of the compound, pointing out the room they'd assigned to Shigaraki. Izuku called on warp and formed a portal, stepping through it to see Shigaraki's room. He then created another portal just above the teen's bed, the other side forming beneath Shigaraki. The young villain gently fell into his bed. Izuku then returned back to the lab, collapsing the portals behind him. Thank you, the doctor said. Now back to what we were trying to work on. The man grabbed a vial from the original's rack. It was labeled 𝗧𝗚𝗏. You have a copy of this already, so first test is to see if you can copy it again. All right, Izuku said. Sounds simple enough. He reached out for the quirk, the thread floating in nothingness, neither end connected to anything. Normally the thread was connected to a faint outline of the body of its holder. He went to grab the thread, but he slipped through it. He tried a few more times, then pulled back. He looked at his hand, where no wisp had formed. Unable to copy it, I presume? The doctor asked, writing down something on a clipboard. No, I can't even grasp the thread like normal. Next, place your copy of 𝗧𝗚𝗏 into this vial, the doctor said, holding out a new vial which he had labeled testing. Izuku did so, feeling odd with not having one of the quirks he'd wielded for several years now. And again, try to copy the original. Izuku reached back out for the original 𝗧𝗚𝗏, finding the thread and going to grasp it. This time, he could. And so he pulled the thread and formed a copy, the white wisp floating in his palm when he looked down. He absorbed it and tested the quirk out, able to use it just like he could before. Fascinating. So you can make multiple copies, but only so long as you don't currently wield one. The doctor placed the vial with Izuku's original copy of 𝗧𝗚𝗏 into a small rack sitting on his desk. He then took the vial containing the original quirk and returned it to the primary rack of quirks before pulling out a different one. Izuku saw the label on it read Brawn Boost, which was one of the simple strength-enhancing quirks the doctor had already had him copy. Your father wields 3 copies of this. The only reason he doesn't have the original, currently, is because of his desire to have you copy it as well. We, of course, never got around to that before now. So, as before you already have a copy of this, so we'll need to place that copy into a containment vial temporarily. Another empty vial was handed to him, in which he placed his copy of Brawn Boost, causing the vial to dimly glow a dark red. He still hadn't figured out why quirks glowed in the colors they did. 𝗧𝗚𝗏 was essentially white, which fit the fact that it was a quirk involving air. But then Shigaraki's decay had glowed the same color as the teenager's hair. So what exactly fed into the color? Izuku shook his head, pushing those thoughts to the side before he got too distracted. With the copy safely stowed in the vial, the doctor handed him the original quirk. He copied it once more. The doctor then swapped the original's vial for the one holding Izuku's first copy. Now, try to pull your first copy back out of the vial and into your body. Izuku did, and felt no odd interaction between the first and second copies. Both still existed in his copy quirk. We've tested your enhanced strength before, so we have a baseline. So, just like before, hit the punching bag as hard as you can and the sensors will record your strength. The doctor gestured towards the part of the lab where they'd set up the exercise equipment used to test Izuku's copies of body-enhancing quirks. Izuku walked over to it and got into his usual fighting stance. He wound his arm back, then hit the punching bag as hard as he could. The bag flew back, slamming into the wall behind it as it broke off the chain holding it up. Izuku stared wide-eyed at it. That hadn't happened when he'd only had one copy of Brawn Boost, so they do indeed stack, just like Master's copies. Will be slightly annoying having to stow away a copy to make a new one, but you can stack multiple versions of body-enhancing quirks just like your father, which will be useful for the future. So I'm keeping both copies? Izuku asked, turning to face the doctor. Why not? We have the original, and I can still make artificial copies for the 𝗚𝗏. Though if we want to add more than 2 copies of the quirk to them, I will need your assistance. But even this one, the doctor knocked on the glass of the primary 𝗚𝗏 stasis tank. We'll only need 2 copies of it, thanks to the other quirks we're planning on putting into it. And you're sure only 2 copies of Brawn Boost will be enough strength for it to handle All Might, should he be alive? Yes, because that won't be the only enhancement quirk it has. Some quirks alter the body, and so neither your father or you would ever really wish to use them. However, that doesn't matter for the 𝗚𝗏 and is partially why this one will look the way it will once I've finished engineering its biology. Fair enough, Izuku said. So is that all the testing you wanted to do with my quirk today? It is, yes. We've verified that you can copy a single quirk multiple times, so long as you don't hold a copy of it when trying to duplicate it. We then checked that you can wield more than one copy of a quirk, but have to transfer the copies back to yourself after storing them in order to do so, which is similar to how the artificial copies work with stacking anyway. We of course know you can't copy a copy, which is why the artificial copies degrade if we try to duplicate a copy rather than the original. I'm stuck with that process for some quirks, given your father still wields a few of the originals himself. I could replace those with copies, couldn't I? Izuku asked. Yes, but it would require you to have physical contact with Master, and I'd prefer to keep him in the regenerative stasis tank for now. Perhaps one day we can attempt that. The doctor put away his clipboard and stored the now-used vials in a small case. Go on home, young master. Have a good evening, Doctor, Izuku said as he formed a portal. Don't work all night again. The doctor chuckled. Sadly, I have a shift at the hospital tonight, but I'll try to take your advice. He waved Izuku off as Izuku stepped through his portal. He didn't get paid enough for this. Eraserhead perched on a rooftop, watching events unfold in the dimly lit street below. A hooded and masked vigilante had stopped two men from harassing a young woman. The woman had run off, though she shouted a quick thank you before doing so. The vigilante, who should have backed off after that, had decided he wanted to beaten a lesson. He sighed as he leapt from the roof, using his capture weapon wrapped around a pipe to slow his descent. Whipping the cloth, it released its hold on the pipe and he wrapped it back around his neck. Look, kid, I think they get it, he said as he approached the vigilante and his two victims. The hooded vigilante whipped around, glaring at him with bright, emerald green eyes that seemed to glow in the moonlight. The two idiots behind him took their chance to run away. Eraserhead already got their faces on camera, and he'd pass the image along to the police later. For now, he had to deal with the vigilante. You do know vigilantism is illegal, right? He asked the masked figure. The vigilante was short, as if he wasn't fully grown. His eyes had a youth to them, which only reinforced Eraserhead's fear that this was, in fact, a kid. Or, well, a teenager most likely. Someone's gotta do the work, hero, the vigilante said, his mask distorting his voice, but the disdain it was clear. And that person is you. Eraserhead raised an eyebrow. I was watching them, too. You just decided to run in before I had a chance to react. What if they had quirks that you couldn't handle, kid? The vigilante's eyes narrowed. I'm not a kid, he said. And even with the voice change, it didn't convince Eraserhead in the slightest. And I can handle anything they might have had. But their quirks weren't combat-oriented. Not strong enough to be, at least. That still doesn't mean you should be taking them on, Eraser said flatly. Come on, kid. He reached out to grab the teenager's arm, but in turn the teenager slipped into a fighting stance. Eraser just rolled his eyes and sighed, flaring his quirk and readying to fight. The teen's eyes flickered, their soft glow disappearing as Eraser affected him. The teen looked down at his hands and frowned. Then he looked up at Eraser in recognition. Oh, you're Eraserhead, he said, suddenly excited. A complete 180 from his mood moments before. Eraser straightened up, though he didn't yet drop his quirk despite the irritation in his eyes. Not gonna fight me now. Oh, definitely not. You're a great hero, from the little I know. The teenager's cheery voice was still prevalent even through his mask's distortion. Finally dropping Eraser, and blinking rapidly for a moment, Eraserhead stared down at the teen in front of him. So why are you out trying to take my job from me, then? He asked, crossing his arms. Well, the teen stammered, the dim glow of his eyes returning. Aizawa figured it must be some kind of night vision quirk. Those guys had been harassing people, and they were small time, so I didn't know if any hero would care, and I didn't know that you patrolled this area, so I just thought slow it down, kid, Aizawa said, interrupting the teen's rambling. Yes, I patrol this area. I recently changed my route, a few months ago, which is probably why you were unaware. But now that you are, I don't want to see you out here again. I'm giving you a pass tonight. You said vigilantism is illegal, so shouldn't you be taking me in? The teen asked, cocking his head to the side in confusion. Yes, but I'm not. You're a kid, don't act like you aren't, and so you have your life ahead of you. If you want to do work like this legally, I suggest trying for a hero school program. You look like you have the potential to excel in those. The kid's eyes narrowed as he huffed. Aizawa surmised he was scowling behind the mask. Look, you may have an issue with heroes, and I can't really blame you with how some of them are. Why do you think I stick to underground work? Aizawa said, but the best way to change it would be from the inside, so why not start there? Now go on, get out of here before I change my mind. The teen sighed. Fine, thanks for not arresting me, and I'll think about what you said. The teen turned and began walking down the alley, which led to a dead end. Aizawa frowned as he watched the boy, wondering where he could be going, before a swirling mass of black mist formed in front of the teenager. He walked through and disappeared, the mist dissipating behind him. So maybe he'd been wrong with his guess as to what the kid's quirk was. He'd have to look into the registry to see if such a quirk was listed anywhere. A few nights later, Izuku suited back up again to head out on his own patrol. He'd try sticking to the shadows a bit more, maybe just observing for the night. He didn't want to get caught by Eraserhead again, and he knew the hero wouldn't have let him close enough to use amnesia. Besides, Eraserhead was a cool hero, and someone that Izuku had no issues with. The man did his job well and made sure to genuinely help people. Plus, underground heroes often received less pay, since they weren't as well known, so Eraserhead certainly wasn't doing it for the money. He warped to an alley only a block from his home, deciding to stick a bit closer to home than usual and maybe avoid dealing with Eraserhead. He hoped he wouldn't have to deal with the hero, because there was no doubt the man would use Erasure and stop him from escaping if they came across one another again. "What did I tell you?" a voice said, immediately ruining Izuku's hopes for the night. He whipped around, looking up to the roof of one of the neighboring buildings where Eraserhead stood, arms crossed. "Eraser," Izuku said cheerily, voice modulator on. "Fancy seeing you here, huh?" Eraserhead just sighed and rappelled down with his capture scarf, coming to stand in front of Izuku. He recrossed his arms and shifted his weight to lean on one leg. He didn't yet flare Erasure. "You're lucky that it seems like your quirk isn't combat-focused, so I won't claim illegal quirk use just yet. But that begs the question as to why you think you can take on villains and thugs if all you can do is make a portal." Right, Izuku had only used warp in front of Eraserhead, and he probably didn't pay much mind to the night vision quirk he wielded, maybe thinking it was some other aspect of the warp quirk. "Right," Izuku said, drawing out the word which only made Eraserhead narrow his eyes. "Well, I work out a lot, so I just use my strength to beat up thugs who go after innocent civilians." Izuku was actually nervous. He hadn't been nervous around anyone for the last few years, except his parents when they got mad at him or disappointed. But they weren't around anymore, and he was now someone who hid veiled threats in his words to the doctor and outright threatened thugs. Yet, Eraserhead made him anxious, goosebumps prickling his arms. "Sure you do," Eraserhead said, unconvinced. "But I told you that if you wanted to do this, you should do it legally and wait a few years. You're what, 14, 15? You should be entering high school soon, so aim for one of the hero academies." 13, Izuku grumbled, though he had no idea why he just gave away his age. He growled at his stupidity. "My point proven," Eraserhead said. "Come on, I'm walking you home, and we're having a conversation with your parents about this." Izuku sighed, looking at his feet. "I don't have parents. Not anymore." "Oh, crap, sorry kid," Eraser said, a sudden softness in his voice. "Still, you can't be out here doing vigilante work, all right? Do you at least have somewhere to stay?" "Yeah, I still have a home, just no one to live in it with me." Why was he explaining this to a hero? "But I get checked up on by a family friend every so often." There was something about Eraserhead that kind of reminded him of his father. A rough exterior, but a heart that cared. Stern words that showed the fondness he had. And somehow, Izuku apparently had earned Eraserhead's care. Or at least, his worry since he gave away his age. And the hero had said Izuku had potential. So maybe. "Well, then we're back to me taking you home. And no quirk, I want to see where you live." Eraserhead turned and began to walk out of the alley. "Come on, kid, don't make this difficult." Izuku sighed and followed after the hero. "I'm old enough to go home on my own," he complained. "Yes, just like you're evidently old enough to be a vigilante. Doesn't mean I trust you to actually do that," Eraserhead said. "So, your quirk is a portal quirk?" Kind of," Izuku said. Then quickly added, "But it's none of your business." "All right," Eraserhead said. They continued to walk in silence. Izuku, probably to his detriment, guided their path towards his home. He would have taken Eraser to his old home, the apartment his family had lived in. But the police had hovered around it too much, and so he and 𝗏𝗏𝗏 had decided to fully move everything that Izuku cared about out of there, then end the lease on the apartment. It was sad to lose his childhood home, but Izuku could only move forward now. They arrived at the apartment he now called home. His father actually owned the entire apartment complex, though under a different name, so his unit was far more upscale than his old home. Of course, the complex was actually overseen by a holding company, also owned by All for One. Once you had enough layers of bureaucracy, people didn't notice the actual head of a company being me. Eraserhead glanced between Izuku and the apartment building they approached. He raised an eyebrow and looked down at Izuku, but he didn't say anything. Izuku walked up the stairs towards his apartment, pulling out the key kept in his pocket, just in case he had to return the normal way. Though he'd never expected to have been escorted home by a hero. He unlocked the door and walked in, turning to face Eraserhead. "Well, I'm home, so." He scuffed his shoe on the floor. "Thanks for walking me home, I guess." Eraserhead just stared at him, then glanced at the apartment number on the door. He narrowed his eyes when he returned his gaze to Izuku. "You know, when your mother was killed, there was an investigation into your family. Of course, we found out that someone had taken you in and that you were well cared for, and given the trauma you'd experienced, the police didn't want to separate you from someone who cared about you, who you knew so well." "I don't," Izuku started, but a raised hand from Eraserhead silenced him. "You obviously knew this, since the police interviewed you several times. Kind of overkill, if you ask me. What could you have possibly known that you hadn't told them the first time?" Eraser said, rolling his eyes. "Anyway, that information was shared with me, because I was part of the investigation." so I recognized the apartment. I suppose that explains your desire to take things into your own hands, doesn't it, Midoriya? Izuku deflated. He'd been an idiot to listen to Eraserhead and let the man escort him home. He'd also been an idiot to let slip any information about himself. All the other heroes and villains he'd met since going out at night had tried asking who he was, too, and he'd never given them even a hint. But something about Eraserhead had changed his mind and he'd let things slip. Fine, Izuku said, pulling off his hood and taking off his mask. Do you want some coffee? Eraserhead snorted. Sure, kid. He walked in, Izuku closing the door behind him. Both of them took off their boots and left them by the door before they walked further into the apartment. Izuku scurried over to the kitchen to make some coffee, leaving Eraserhead in the living room. The hero scanned the apartment, seemingly taking it all in. So you live alone, now? The hero asked. Izuku hesitated to answer the question. Kurogiri was hardly around, though he always left a prepared lunch for Izuku to take to school, just to show he still cared. So technically, Izuku did live alone. And he was still a minor, which meant if the authorities knew of that, they'd force him into the system. Apparently the hesitation answered Eraser's question. He just sighed. Look, kid, I can't in good conscience leave you to live alone. You said you're 13, so you're a minor. There it was. But I also know the system sucks. Oh, that was surprising. To be honest, I was actually told to patrol this area specifically because of you. My normal route is nearby, given the proximity to UA, but still it was a change requested by the police. Why would they redirect a hero to watch out for me? Izuku asked as he poured 2 mugs of steaming coffee. He padded back out into the living room and handed one to the hero. Thanks. Eraser took a long swig of coffee. And it's because they have this ridiculous belief that your mother was an accomplice to a villain. The fight in which she was a casualty. Except, I wasn't told who that villain is, or what even happened exactly that caused your mother's death. It sounds like some big conspiracy that you were somehow wrapped up in. Izuku grimaced. He hated being reminded of his mom's death, but he found it interesting that Eraserhead wasn't given the full story about All for One and All Might's fight. The latter still hadn't been seen by the public since that day, and the news reported that he was abroad or something. Though the doctor had discovered that the hero was alive, just still recovering from the fight. Eraserhead hummed. Sorry, I suppose that's a sore subject. It's fine, Izuku muttered. And, well, he couldn't tell the hero the truth, but maybe he could spin it. The detectives that interviewed me asked something like that. If I knew who my father really was. My dad traveled a lot, so he wasn't home too often, so I guess it's possible I didn't know him that well. But, I don't know, their questions were so weird. And like you said, they interrogated me several times before finally accepting my answers. Yeah, the police went a bit overboard. Eraserhead shrugged. There's one thing that I do have a question about, though. If you'll let me ask. Izuku furrowed his brow, but he nodded. Your mother had a telekinesis quirk, and your father's was listed as a fire-breathing quirk. Yet yours seems to be a portal quirk. I, didn't hear a question in that. Izuku said. Right, well, I suppose my question circles back to what the police asked you about. Are you sure you know the truth about who your father is, or was? I mean, I guess not. But why would my parents lie about his quirk to me? I witnessed my mom's quirk, so I know she was truthful. Right, and she evidently used it slightly when she almost dropped something at the law firm she worked at. So we have verification of her quirk, Eraserhead said, nodding slightly. I was just curious. After seeing you use your quirk to leave a few days ago, and then again tonight, you seem to have quite good control over it. Yeah, Izuku said. So, am I in trouble, then? Eraserhead sighed. No, kid, I'm not going to arrest you or even report your quirk use. But I will inform the police that you no longer have a guardian. Izuku hummed sadly at that, dropping his gaze to the floor. However, Izuku's eyes shot back up to meet the hero's. I've seen what you can do, and the aftermath of some of your previous nights out. You're a good kid, and have a lot of potential. I'd hate to see someone like you get destroyed by being stuck in the system, so I can continue living here. No, but I'm willing to offer you the spare room in my place. You can still attend 𝗓𝗲𝗏, and I'll work on getting you a proper place to stay. Your family had friends, the 𝗵𝘃𝗤𝐵s, right? Izuku cringed at that thought. Not the 𝗵𝘃𝗤𝐵s, please. Auntie and uncle are nice people, but I don't want to live with them. Very well, then we'll see what we can do. But for now, I think you should stay with me. So pack a bag and we'll head out. But what about your patrol? Izuku asked. I'm ending it early, Eraserhead said flatly. Izuku sighed and put his now empty mug in the sink. He then walked off to his bedroom to pack up a few days' worth of clothes. He'd have to wait and see what came of this. The doctor watched the camera feed of Izuku's apartment entrance. He saw as the boy was escorted home by the pro-hero Eraserhead and brought a hand to his chin and thought. About an hour later, he watched the duo leave, though this time Izuku's hood and mask were off and he carried a duffel bag. He got a text from the young boy and read it. The boy was evidently being taken in by Eraserhead, given the fact that he was now living alone due to Kurogiri's focus on Shigaraki. It wasn't Izuku's fault that the brat Shigaraki needed more supervision than he did. But alas, this was how things would be. The doctor would inform Kurogiri of the change, but they'd leave the apartment ready for Izuku's use as a continued safe house, especially since he used the hidden room as a sort of base of operations. On the bright side, this gave them easy access to one of the most useful and powerful quirks they'd had on their radar for several years, erasure. Not only could Izuku make a copy of it, but he could entirely take it from the heroes. The light of his computer screen glinted off his glasses and he smiled. Things were still going their way, even if the young master was now in the arms of the heroes. They walked into the apartment that Eraserhead called home. Both of them took off their boots at the entrance. Izuku placed another pair of shoes, his normal ones, next to his boots. Then he followed Eraserhead deeper into the apartment. It was late, around 3 o'clock in the morning. Unsurprisingly, the apartment was dim, though not fully dark. Izuku understood that, seeing as he often left a few lights on at his place when going out at night. It just made sense for a hero to leave some lights on when going out for patrol at night. The sound of something small trotting through the house drew Izuku's attention. A cat hopped up on the counter next to Eraserhead, who had started brewing some more coffee. The cat sat there and meowed loudly, causing the hero to groan before reaching over and scratching behind the cat's ears. "You have a cat?" Izuku asked as he set his duffel bag down and walked over to the counter, taking a seat on one of the stools on the opposite side from Eraserhead. "2 cats, actually. The other one is probably hiding somewhere," the hero responded, turning to face Izuku. "This is Callie. I'm sure you can guess why that's her name. And no, I'm not the one who named her." The cat turned to look at Izuku. It was a calico, which explained the name. But if the hero hadn't named her, who did? The cat walked over to Izuku and looked at him curiously before meowing at him. Izuku reached out to pet her and she melted into his hand. "If you didn't name her, who did?" Izuku asked. Eraserhead started, then paused, seemingly unsure how to continue. He then sighed and explained, "My partner, and no, I don't mean in the hero sense. You'll probably meet him in show," a voice said from the nearby hallway. Another man sleepily walked into the kitchen, rubbing at his eyes as he put on a pair of glasses. He was blonde, his hair tied up in a messy bun. "The morning," Eraser finished before sighing again. "Or not, because for once he's a light sleeper." The man walked over to Eraserhead and inspected him. "I'm fine, 𝗧𝗍. Just something came up so I ended patrol early." He pointed at Izuku, the something. The other man turned to look at Izuku and although it took him a moment, Izuku realized he recognized the man. He wasn't in his hero costume, but the face was still the same. "Wait, you're present, Mike," Izuku said excitedly. The voice hero was one of the few heroes Izuku still genuinely liked, mostly because he enjoyed the man's radio show, often listening to it on his walks to or from school, when he hadn't been escorted by Kurogiri. "Sure am, lil listener," Mike said with a smile. "Though out of costume, I'm Yamada 𝗧𝗍. And who might you be?" "𝗧𝗍. The world must be playing a cruel joke on Izuku. Someone with such a similar name to his father coming into his life." Kurogiri may have been right in that he'd finally gathered the emotional control that his father had, but he was still his mother's son. His eyes stung as tears threatened his cheeks. Eraserhead stepped in, noticing the sudden change in Izuku's mood. "This is Midoriya Izuku. You remember that case 𝗧𝗏𝗄𝐺 pulled me on?" "He's the kid," Eraser said. Then he turned to Izuku. "And you can call me Aizawa when I'm not on patrol." "Oh, that case. Well, then, lil listener, you're welcome in our home. Make yourself comfortable, and I'll get the spare room ready for you." Mike smiled at him before heading off down the hall and rummaging in the closet for spare bedding. Aizawa watched him go, then turned back to Izuku. "Similar name as your father, right?" "Sorry, kid." "That's fine," Izuku mumbled. "Your face tells me otherwise, but whatever you say, kid." Aizawa turned and poured 2 mugs of fresh coffee, sliding one across the countertop to Izuku. "How about we talk about you some more? Your quirk is some kind of warping one. Because as far as I'm aware, officially you don't have a quirk." Izuku chuckled awkwardly and took a sip of his coffee. Yeah. My parents wanted to keep my quirk a secret. For, reasons I'm not comfortable talking about just yet." "Fair enough, kid. But we should probably update your information at some point. I won't make you do it now, but if you have any interest in going to a hero school, which I'm sure you do given your nightly adventures, then you'll need your quirk listed on official documents." "Okay," Izuku mumbled, sipping at his coffee. He wasn't sure how he'd explain his quirk. Well, quirks to Aizawa and Mike. And did he want to go to a hero academy? It could be fun, and he'd get to work things from the inside. It was that moment that he realized something. "Wait, you said your patrol route was near UA, like it mattered." "Right," Aizawa said. "Well, why does that matter?" "Because I teach at UA." "What?" Izuku practically yelled, causing Mike to come running back into the room. "Is everything okay?" he asked frantically. "Yes, 𝗧𝗍. I just told the kid that I work at UA," Aizawa said flatly. Mike burst out laughing. "Oh, that's all?" he asked, wiping a laughing tear from his eye. Yeah, little listener, both of us work there. Sho here is one of the hero course homeroom teachers and I teach English. Izuku just gaped at them both. Yue had always piqued his interest ever since he was a kid and first started his hero obsession, partially due to its prestige as the #1 hero school in Japan, but also partially because of his former obsession with the #1 hero, whose alma mater was Yue. Even with the latter reason gone, Izuku still couldn't help his excitement at the prospect of attending the prestigious high school. So, you think I could be a hero, then? Izuku asked, pulling the conversation back to Aizawa's continued mention of Izuku going to a hero academy. The man shrugged. I don't see why not. You have a useful and quite powerful quirk, from the little I've seen. You already have the helpful heart of a hero, given your takedowns of several thugs and minor villains. How do you know I caught any villains? I could have been bad at the whole vigilante thing, Izuku said, looking away from the heroes. Aizawa snorted. A few of the people you saved mentioned they were helped by someone around your height, wearing a dark sweatshirt and a mask. I can put the rest together myself. Right, Izuku muttered. His mug sat empty before him, the caffeine doing little to keep him awake. It was decaf, by the way, Aizawa said. Izuku's gaze shot back to the man, a look of betrayal on his face. You need sleep. Don't you have school in the morning? Yeah. Aizawa sat his mug down and walked around the kitchen island. He picked up Izuku's duffel bag and began walking down the hall, beckoning for Izuku to follow. The teen did, getting up off of the stool and stretching for a moment, a traitorous yawn forcing its way out. Izuku groaned as he walked after Aizawa. The spare room was basic, probably hardly used, but the bedding looked homey. It's our spare, so it's lived in, Mike said from behind them, having noticed Izuku's eyes drawn to the blankets and pillows on the bed. Bathroom is right across the hall, Aizawa said, pointing to the mentioned room. Get some sleep, kid. Izuku yawned again. MK, he mumbled, rubbing his eyes as he dug into his duffel bag, which Aizawa had set near the bed, for his toothbrush. A few weeks passed and Izuku found himself feeling truly at home with the two heroes. Aizawa had discussed the situation with the detective in charge of the Midoriya case, and the man had apparently pulled some strings so Izuku didn't have to worry about moving out. They were still waiting on a home visit according to Aizawa, where Child Protective Services would ensure the home was fit to live in, and then Aizawa and Mike could responsibly look after a teenager while also being heroes. In order to prove they could, both had reduced their patrol schedules, meaning outside of their UA work, one of them was always at home, though most of that for Aizawa was spent napping. Izuku learned that Mike was the better cook between the two, and always enjoyed the pancake breakfasts the man would make each week. It had become a tradition. It was fast approaching the end of his first year in middle school, and Izuku was honestly surprised at how much his life had changed in just that year. At the start of the summer term, he'd still had his parents. He had barely known of the crime empire his father ran. But now he knew the truth. His view of heroes had changed drastically, though the two that took him in were exceptions. He still kept his quirk hidden, but maybe he'd change that soon. Maybe he'd finally reveal to Aizawa what his quirk was, and hope the man didn't suddenly view him differently and want him out of his home. In the meantime, he'd secretly decided to copy 𝗎𝗫𝗎. It was an extremely useful quirk and would help him on the nights he decided to go out. He'd only been out a handful of times since being taken in by Aizawa and Mike, and only on nights when Aizawa didn't patrol. He was of course extremely tired the next morning, and he doubted Aizawa hadn't figured it out yet, but the man didn't mention anything. He hadn't yet tried to use 𝗎𝗫𝗎, having just copied it a few days prior, shortly after Aizawa had wished him good night and turned to walk out of Izuku's bedroom. Izuku stood in front of the bathroom mirror, pulling on the new quirk and flaring it. His eyes glowed red as he activated it, and he instantly knew why Aizawa always complained about how dry his eyes got. Hey, kid, you done in there yet? Aizawa called, opening the bathroom door and coming face to face with Izuku. The teen gulped, 𝗎𝗫𝗎 still active as he stared up at Aizawa. The man froze, staring back at him, confusion on his face. Izuku quickly dropped the quirk, rubbing at his irritated eyes. Aizawa gently shoved him out of the way to stare at the mirror himself, activating 𝗎𝗫𝗎. His eyes glowed red and his hair began to float upwards. Izuku mentally noted that he hadn't gotten that part of the quirk. Either that or his hair was too curly and thick for it to be noticeable. The man turned off his quirk then looked down at Izuku. Explain, he said, his tone giving no room for argument. Well, you see, Izuku began, wringing his hands nervously. Aizawa raised a brow and crossed his arms. Izuku sighed. I can copy quirks, he muttered. What was that? Aizawa asked. I can copy quirks, Izuku repeated a little louder. And I keep whatever I copy. He wouldn't mention his ability to actually take quirks. He didn't need that getting back to the police since that would probably bring hell down on his life. That's why my parents wanted to keep my quirk a secret. It's powerful, and I'm sorry for copying your quirk. It's just Aizawa put a hand on Izuku's shoulder. It's okay, kid. It makes sense that you'd want to keep that kind of quirk under wraps. And I'm not mad that you copied my quirk, though I wish you would have asked first. Izuku was breathing hard, anxiety flooding his body. Despite Aizawa's calmness, Izuku still thought this would ruin everything. That he'd be thrown out, that the police would come for him and connect him with 𝗓𝗏. And then what? Would he be charged with the crimes of his father? Would they force him to sell out the doctor and Kurogiri? Hey, Aizawa said, kneeling down in front of Izuku. Slow, deep breaths. He took Izuku's hand and placed it on his own chest, guiding Izuku through the breathing until the teen calmed down. Once his breathing was normal again, Izuku stumbled back before sliding down to sit on the bathroom floor next to the shower. He pulled his knees to his chest as tears prickled his eyes. Aizawa still knelt there, waiting for Izuku to be ready to talk some more. He closed the bathroom door and leaned back against it, slowly sliding to sit on the floor as well. Everything okay? Mike asked through the door, probably having heard Izuku's panicked breathing. Fine, 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗍, go on to bed, Aizawa said back, his gaze not leaving Izuku's. The sounds of Mike shuffling back to their bedroom disappeared down the hallway. A few more minutes passed as Izuku calmed down. He wiped his eyes with his sleeve. So, Aizawa finally said, you can copy quirks, and they're permanent copies. Why yeah, Izuku said quietly, not meeting the hero's gaze. That's quite the powerful quirk, Izuku, Aizawa said. So that warping quirk is something you copied, then? Izuku nodded. From a family friend, but I can't tell you who. Aizawa nodded back. Fair enough. I'm assuming there's a lot more to your life than you feel comfortable telling me, or can even tell me at all. But I do have a few questions, if that's okay with you. Go ahead, Izuku said. First, do you have any problems controlling the quirks you copy? Though, I kind of just inherently know how to use them. Apparently it's how my dad's quirk worked as well. Okay, do the copies interfere with the original in any way? As in, does your using it prevent the owner of it from using it? No, not at all. It's entirely separate, Izuku quickly explained. So you never have to worry about not having your quirk just because I copied it, I promise. Aizawa seemed to visibly relax after that statement. Good, and I wasn't just asking because you copied erasure. Izuku still felt awkward at being caught. Final question. Is there some truth to the detective's belief that you and your mother are connected to some big villain? Izuku hesitated. Maybe. Aizawa just sighed. Problem child, he said, but it sounded fond rather than annoyed. So, what do you want to do from here? Wait, what? Izuku asked, confused. Was he not getting turned in? Was Aizawa not going to tell Detective 𝗧𝗏𝗄𝐐𝐻 the truth? What do you mean? This is your life, Izuku. You didn't choose to be related to who you're related to. We don't get to choose our birth parents. And from what I can tell, you aren't a villain. You tried to help people, even if some of that helping resulted in heroes getting in trouble. A small smirk appeared on Aizawa's face. They deserved it, to be fair. That made Izuku chuckle. If you're wanting to become a hero, we do really need to register your quirk accurately. But we don't have to tell them everything. And 𝗧𝗏𝗄𝐻 is a friend. I can probably pull some strings so they leave you alone. But he might still want to ask you a few questions. Everything Aizawa just said. What he essentially promised, that Izuku didn't need to reveal his past, pinged true to his copy of the detective's quirk. The hero was really going to protect him from whatever the authorities would want to do with the child of 𝗓𝗏, even if Aizawa didn't know the full truth himself. I think I'd like that, yeah, Izuku said. I've hated hiding my quirk. Kids at school bully me for being quirkless even though I'm not. They do what? Aizawa was suddenly very serious. Izuku just rolls his eyes. Well, they try to bully me, but it's not like it bothers me. It's more annoying than anything. They try to belittle me, insult me, sometimes threaten me with their quirks. He shrugs. Not like the teachers let it get that far. They know the truth, or at least whatever my dad told them. Teachers always try to stay on my good side. Aizawa's eyes narrow. If you're sure it's not a big deal. It's not. But you'd tell me if it was. Well, yeah, figured, Aizawa sighed. I know you can handle yourself, even without using your quirks. But still, if you need help, tell me. Okay, Izuku said. He took a deep breath. They were still sitting there on the bathroom floor. I guess we should probably, get out of the bathroom. Aizawa snorted. Yeah, probably. 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏 probably thinks something horrible happened. I'll let you tell him about your quirk. Aizawa stood, turning to grab the door handle. Small bit of advice, though. Don't copy his quirk. It's far more annoying to control than you probably think. I'm guessing it doesn't turn off. Nope. So he's always focused on keeping his voice at a normal level. Good to know, Izuku said, standing up. I'm gonna brush my teeth and go to bed. I don't believe that in the slightest, Aizawa said flatly as he walked out of the bathroom. And I'd rather not have to add an extra patrol tonight. What? Did you really think I let you go out on your own all the time? Aizawa asked, turning to face Izuku, one eyebrow raised. Kid, I was like you once, and I was lucky that I was never caught. You're lucky because you have me looking out for you. But you really need to stop going out at night. Stop being a vigilante. Wait until you're at UA or wherever and have a provisional license, at least. Yeah, that'll be a few years from now, but at least it'll be legal. Izuku deflated. He wasn't surprised Aizawa knew about his continued night adventures, but he wouldn't have guessed the man followed him every night. He had to be better at situational awareness, because someone like him shouldn't be able to be followed so easily. For now, he'd give in and listen to his guardian. Okay, I'm sorry, Izuku said quietly. Aizawa sighed. Kid, you don't need to apologize. Like I said, I know what it feels like. I just don't want your potential ruined because you got caught. All right. So actually go to bed, please. With that, the man walked off down the hall, heading for the master bedroom. Izuku sighed as he finally got to brushing his teeth. It was going to be different, but good, to finally be able to be truthful about his quirk, though the secret of All for One would remain with him. There was no point in revealing that the quirk still existed, especially if the heroes and authorities who did know of the man presumed him dead. Hello again, Midoriya. Hope you've been well while living with Eraserhead. The detective smiled at him, though Izuku could see the man was just as tired as Aizawa always seemed to be. This man just did a better job of hiding it to most people. Yeah, it's been nice, Izuku admitted. So, what's going to happen today? Well, I'm going to ask you some more questions. And we'll also work on filling out the official paperwork to update your quirk. Normally that can be done at any quirk registry office, but since you're here for other reasons, I can help get that settled away as well. Okay, Izuku said. He'd been required to have a one-on-one discussion with the detective, despite Aizawa's objections. They sat in one of the interrogation rooms, and the detective swore that no one was behind the one-way mirror on one end of the room. Izuku was too smart to believe that, even if didn't have a copy of the detective's lie detector quirk which already told him the man was lying about that. So, let's get started with the questions. First, what is your quirk? The ability to copy the quirk of anyone else. I keep the copy of the quirk forever, as far as I know, since I've held the copy of my mom's quirk since I was 4. It doesn't affect the person whose quirk I've copied, and they can continue using theirs like normal. Could you tell me how many quirks you've copied so far in your life? Wouldn't I be in trouble for copying someone's quirk since it's technically illegal use of my own? If the quirk you copied was offered voluntarily, then technically no. Izuku thought for a moment. All the quirks he'd copied from his father and the doctor's storage were technically given voluntarily. Warp was offered by Kurogiri as a birthday gift, and even Erasure was now technically a permitted copy, once Aizawa understood what happened. The only quirk that was taken without the permission of the owner was Lie Detector, but Izuku didn't have to admit that. He tried to count out the total number of quirks he had copies of. The time it took him obviously surprised the detective. He would discount the duplicates of quirks, like Brawn Boost and Kinetic Booster. He had a total of 2 copies of both in the end, having gotten the 2 Kinetic Boosters during one of his last visits to the doctor early on in his time living with Aizawa and Mike. I have 8 copied quirks, Izuku said truthfully. The detective's eyes widened, then his brow furrowed as he nodded and wrote down Izuku's answer. Would you be willing to tell me what those quirks are? Do I have to? Technically no. At this point, they would be considered part of your quirk, and we'll be recording the existence of that officially. Izuku's copy of Lie Detector pinged true, so that meant this really was a loophole. Good to know. Then next question, Izuku asked, forcing the detective to move on. He looked disappointed at not being told the copied quirks. What are the names of your parents? Midoriya Hisashi and Midoriya Izuku. Did either of them go by any other names? Not to me, Izuku said. It was true, to be fair. His father never went by All for One to Izuku. What were their occupations? My mom was a lawyer, focusing in hero law. My dad kind of did all sorts of things as far as I'm aware. He would disappear for days on jobs, sometimes overseas. He has money in a lot of businesses, stocks which I guess kind of come to me now. The detective nodded, not giving any hint as to whether Izuku's half-truth about his father pinged true to his quirk. He figured it would. Technically, All for One did do all kinds of jobs. He did go overseas, though nowhere near as often as his mom claimed, and he did have stock in a lot of businesses, mostly because he partially owned them. Do you have any belief that either of your parents are alive? Izuku glared at the detective. What a stupid question to ask a teenager who saw the mangled body of his mother when he had to help identify her. Kurogiri hadn't been able to come with him at that time, partially because they wanted to keep the warper hidden from the authorities as much as they could. He was too important. No, Izuku said sternly. My dad disappeared right around the same time as my mom getting killed, and you and I both know my mother is dead. You had me come and make sure the body was her. Yes, of course, I apologize, but the question had to be asked. The detective paused for a moment before asking another question. Have you ever met a man who goes by the name All for One? Now that was risky. His dad never went by All for One around Izuku. He also never really went by that name around the doctor or Kurogiri, both only ever referring to him as master. Izuku knew he didn't have long to answer before the detective would get suspicious, so he risked it. "No," he said simply. "Who is that?" He decided to pry, to see if the detective would give any information away. The man hummed. "It doesn't matter. He's just someone we've been interested in, and might have connections to the battle that killed your mother." Izuku almost laughed. They were trying to get him to turn against 𝗓𝗏, his father, by claiming he might have been her killer. Except Izuku knew the truth. And this detective knew, too. Izuku risked asking a question of his own. Is he connected to All Might? 𝗓𝗏, All Might, kinda similar, yeah. The detective paled for a moment before coughing to clear his throat and his nerves. No, not that we're aware of. Liar. Izuku felt the quirk he'd copied from this man blatantly call out his lie. He almost smirked. Speaking of All Might, I haven't seen him in a while. I used to have all kinds of merch of him. What happened to him? He's taking a break, is all I know. That pinged true. So All Might was taking a break. A forced break, since if Izuku's dad had barely survived their fight, he had no doubt the #1 hero almost died too. Do you have any more questions, or can we do the quirk registry thing? I'm sure Aizawa is getting antsy. I kinda wanna see what he'd look like when angry. Believe me, no you don't, the detective said under his breath, barely audible to Izuku. We can go out to my desk to fill out the paperwork. I believe, as your current legal guardian, Aizawa has already filled out his part. Wait, he's my legal guardian? Izuku asked, unable to help the excitement in his voice. The detective chuckled, probably relieved at the change in mood from the questioning to now. Yes, you weren't needed at home for the home check, so Yamada hosted our social services for it. Unsurprisingly, they passed and have officially become your legal foster parents. Izuku's smile was wide as they left the interrogation room, to be quickly met with Aizawa. He gave Izuku an odd look, not expecting such an emotion to be on the teen's face after an interrogation. I told him about you and Yamada officially becoming his guardians. Oh, Aizawa said, relaxing. I take it you're happy about that, kid? Izuku nodded. Definitely. Thank you for taking me in. I'd have been an asshole not to, Aizawa said, ruffling Izuku's hair. Detective 𝗧𝗏𝗁 took them to his desk, where he handed a document to Izuku. Fill out the remainder of that, including your quirk's name and a short explanation of what it does. Izuku took the paper and picked up a pen. He filled out his personal information, name, date of birth, all that fun stuff. Then he paused, trying to figure out what to actually call his quirk. The doctor had said there was a failed version of his quirk that only lasted 5 minutes, running around somewhere in the world called copy. So Izuku couldn't use that. He pondered for a moment as he wrote down the short explanation of his quirk before returning to the quirk name box. He perked up when he figured out a name for it. The detective took back the document, reading it over before adding it to a small stack of papers. All right, that's everything settled. Thank you for coming in and bearing with the questions, Midoriya. And congratulations to you both on the new home situation. Izuku nodded, giving a small thanks to the detective as he stood up to follow Aizawa. Thanks, 𝗧𝗏𝗁, Aizawa said. He set a hand on Izuku's shoulder and guided their way out of the police precinct. They hopped in the car and began driving away before he glanced over at Izuku in the passenger seat. What took you so long on the quirk paperwork? Oh, I had to figure out what to call it, Izuku said. Did your doctor or parents never give it a name? Not really. We just referred to it as copy. But I also heard from my doctor that there was another copy quirk out there, which manifested right before mine, I think. They had already labeled that one copy, so I figured I might as well use a different name. What did you decide on? Duplicate. Same premise, just different term. Fair enough. Aizawa was silent for a few minutes before stealing another glance towards Izuku. How was the interrogation? Izuku frowned. Basically the same as the other ones, besides the detective asking me about my quirk. He let out a humorless laugh. He asked me if I thought either of my parents could still be alive. What? Aizawa asked, raising an eyebrow. Why would he feel the need to ask that? Because of the whole possibly being related to a villain, Izuku said. But I can't believe he asked if I thought my mom was alive. He was the one who took me to the morgue to identify her body. Damn, sorry, kid. That must have been difficult. It was. Her body wasn't. It. Izuku couldn't finish the statement as his mind flashed back to that day, to seeing his mother's mangled, bloody corpse after a building had collapsed on her. All thanks to All Might. You don't have to tell me about it, Izuku. Believe me, I know all about seeing the body of someone you care about. Izuku wondered who Aizawa had lost. But he wouldn't pry. They'd both tell each other when they wanted. So is there a chance your father is still alive? I don't know, Izuku lied. His dad was still alive, though barely, being kept alive by medical technology and a few quirks inside of a stasis tank. He disappeared around the same time as my mom's death, so I just figure he's dead. Was he with your mom that day? Izuku just nodded in response. He'd already essentially told Aizawa he was related to a villain. But the man didn't pry, and Izuku wouldn't explain more anyway. Besides, Aizawa saw the heroic potential in Izuku, so he didn't care about the teen's past. Well, let's head home and see what 𝗧𝗏 wants to do for dinner, huh? What, you're not going to cook? Izuku teased, grinning at his foster dad. You act like that and I just might, Aizawa said, reaching over to ruffle Izuku's hair again.